together every year and share stories of progress. Some do this by going to high holiday services, and Yom Kippur starts tomorrow night. You're welcome to join me on Zoom. But others do it by attending conferences like the Atlantic, and through attending programs like we've had for Black Cannabis Week. And we gather to hear and to share stories of change. We do this when we're listening to the State of the State request addresses. We hear how far we've come. We hear all that's been accomplished on our quest to create a broader industry, a more inclusive industry. And we hear all the places that we're stuck and what's holding us back and the work that still needs to be done. We reflect on the fact that just a few months ago, cannabis was deemed already known, that this plant that we love is critical to the healthcare and self-care of millions of Americans. The late and great Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg once remarked that real change, enduring change, happens one step at a time. My prayer, my hope for you, for me, for everyone at this conference is that we leave reminded that change is possible and that we have a role to play, that all we need to do is take one step together.
High school as a young person, first learning the rules of the road and the laws of the land, and I learned very quickly that our communities, I'm a Latino, Puerto Rican, but Black and brown communities were targeted disproportionately for arrest. And then as I started to get involved in the movement to legalize cannabis, we were left out of the economic opportunities that were made with blah, blah, blah. Hold on, let me get something to drink real quick.
Take your time.
Normally I'm on the other side of the camera. I'm just like, it's fine, just keep going.
So that was literally a great direction. You're doing
Yeah.
Well.
All right. Hello and welcome to the Canaanite Conference. My name is Jason Ortiz. I am the president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, and we're one of the sponsors of this event. The Minority Cannabis Business Association is a 501c6. That's not true. I gotta stop saying that. Oh my God! All right. Because now I have to like. color into the cannabis industry as owners, employees, and consumers. And we are a proud sponsor of the Canaanite Conference. I myself am from Hartford, Connecticut, so I'm in the Northeast, and I was actually first involved in the cannabis justice movement when I was arrested in high school. And so I was one of those people that had their life disrupted by the war on drugs, but quickly got involved with the movement to legalize cannabis so that folks that came after me didn't have to go through the same struggles. As I started to get more involved, I noticed that folks like myself, Puerto Ricans, Latinos, African Americans, and other people of color were being left out of the legalization movement. So I wanted to make sure that as we move forward with legalization, our communities were included both in the opportunities on the business side, but also so that our communities are reinvested in after being so directly damaged by the war on drugs. So I'm super excited to be here and be a part of this conference. And anytime that there's a big group of people coming together, especially the people of color, to get things done, MCBA is going to be there to help you provide the really solid policies and other recommendations when it comes to activism and organizing to help you be a better organizer in your community. So I look forward to all the very specific debates we're going to have later, and also reaching out to all of you who want to get more involved with cannabis organizing to see what we can do to work together. So again, thank you all so much for being here. If you want to get more information on MCBA, we're at minoritycannabis.org. Always looking for new members around the country and looking forward to organizing with y'all in Pennsylvania and throughout the Can-Atlantic area in 2021. So again, thanks again. I'm looking forward to working.
One system dialog displayed. One system dialog displayed. One system dialog displayed.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Can-Atlantic Conference. My name is Ricardo Baca. It is a pleasure to be here speaking with you today. You know, a little bit about me. I am the founder and CEO of Grasslands, a journalism-minded agency. We handle PR and marketing for brands and executives in highly regulated industries, including cannabis and hemp, which I am immensely passionate about. And of course, that's why I'm here today. But truth be told, in a previous life, I actually came from journalism, as you might imagine from my firm's name. You know, I got started in journalism, very humble beginnings, going back to high school, back at Westminster High School, a suburb of Denver. And I remember a teacher grabbing me in the hall and saying, "Do you want to write for the newspaper?" Next thing I knew, I was the sports editor and having a blast. And something she said, something our advisor said really stuck with me and also brought me in so much so that I had to wonder if this might be my calling. She told me that journalism holds the powerful accountable, and that could be a government official at any level of government, and it also could be a corporate official. And I really liked that idea of just having that backstop, having somebody there, some entity there, the fourth estate, to keep people honest who aren't always honest. So, you know, it goes through college. I worked for a number of great newspapers. I ended up landing at the Denver Post, and that was my most recent job before Grasslands. I was there for more than 12 years as the music critic, the entertainment editor, and then right before Colorado implemented those legal cannabis sales on January 1st, 2014, I was appointed as the newspaper's very first marijuana editor, which was an utter treat to kind of help modernize cannabis coverage, because previously newspapers and TV stations had primarily bought that corporate government line that weed is evil, reefer madness, you're familiar with it all. And we had a unique opportunity being here in Colorado to talk about this from a more modern perspective, a more fact and science-based perspective. And that's what my colleagues and I did at the Denver Post and at the Cannabis, which was the news vertical we created, had a lot of fun with, made a lot of changes to journalism from. In fact, it reminds me, you know, going back to that whole holding the powerful accountable piece, one of the first big investigations I wrote on the cannabis beat happened to be about inconsistently dosed edible products. And remind you, it's early 2014, the regulated market is brand new. I happened to make my first edibles purchase at a dispensary that January, and this chocolate bar was not having its intended effect. I had double my dose, triple my dose, quarter my dose, and next thing I know, nothing is happening. So I put it in a Ziploc bag in the refrigerator, and I knew I would see that chocolate bar again, this time for work purposes. 2 months later, I got a call from the owner of a small dispensary chain. She told me that she had had more than 400 returns on one brand's product. And sure enough, it was the same brand of the product that I bought in January that clearly had no THC. And I took that story, that experience, to the front page of the Sunday paper, and I held the powerful accountable. This giant of the industry at that time had to face the consequences of their actions. They had not put THC, the one ingredient we were purchasing this chocolate bar for, inside the product, and they had to answer to me and to their customers and to my readers. I also went to the state government and the city government and asked them why they didn't have mandatory testing for these edible products and the potency involved. And they weren't prepared for it. You know, they had to rush out a system approximately 13 months after we voted to legalize. And, you know, they were learning to build the airplane as they were flying it. You've heard the adage, and it's actually pretty true. And sure enough, my story, my reporting led to a couple different changes. One, that edibles manufacturer went out of business. And two, the state of Colorado, 2-3 months later, implemented mandatory potency testing for all recreational products sold inside the state. And so, you know, this is the kind of reporting and accountability that journalism really brings. And that's what we're here to talk about right now. That's my background, clearly. You know, and also, it's fair to say that a majority of the people here at the Canaanite Conference rely on journalism on a daily basis. Whether that is the B2C reporting of your daily newspaper and your favorite magazine, or the B2B reporting of the trade publications you rely so heavily on, MJ Biz included. So when was the last time you supported these outlets? You know, whether it's buying a subscription to MJ Biz, the magazine, or shooting over a Patreon donation to our friends over at Marijuana Moments, I can't encourage you enough to support the media that is most important to you. Because if you rely on them, they're relying on you, and all too many of us are not paying for the media that we are so relying on so heavily, that enhances our business decisions and our strategies and our daily lives. So with that, I just want to leave you with that. Please do support the media that is most important to you. Please share those media outlets on your social media channels. It is so important that you do that. And with that, thanks again for joining us at the Canaanite Conference, and get ready for all the learning ahead.
Thank you. Thank you to Tahid and the organizers for inviting me to speak here at the country's first Mid-Atlantic Cannabis Conference about why it's important to get involved in the movement to end cannabis prohibition and to legalize it equitably. I have just completed a 3-year term as a regulator in Massachusetts, and maybe almost 20 years as an activist, lawyer, recruiter, business owner, campaign consultant, and a government official now. And I've been part of the movement, in my opinion, the whole time. And what I can tell you in this chaotic time is that the cannabis movement has always been chaotic and unpredictable because traditional rules do not apply. And that's a beautiful thing. Cannabis is a place where if you become informed yourself, no matter who you are, you can really accomplish whatever you want. You can write and pass your own laws as a citizen in many states. You can invent a completely new product. You can be an inventor. You can force your government to let you grow cannabis at home or whatever is appropriate. And down the line, you will be able to create an entirely new type of experience at a bar or an art gallery or a yoga studio where people can use cannabis the way they always have as part of their daily life out in the open. That is definitely the next thing that is coming. But the only reason that, despite setbacks, this movement keeps winning and progressing is because people are informed. I have seen that time and time again from different angles. Citizens and media forcing your government to be transparent is so important. Citizens and media holding government and businesses accountable is so important. And most importantly, citizens and media who know what they're talking about when it comes to these issues and refuse to be tricked by the typical tricks, astroturfing, divide and conquer, manipulation. This is why we keep smashing barriers and moving forward and getting the change that we are demanding that a lot of groups don't want us to get. Each state law is building on previous experience when it passes, and each state law is better than the last because people are informed. And that process of understanding and staying on top of the developments and the details, the complex details, and sharing that information democratically to keep people civically engaged. This is the fundamental driver of positive change, in my experience. But it takes a community, and it takes a community mindset, not an individual mindset, and we can't ever lose that. I will leave you with one plea, which is that having gone straight from being an activist to being a government official, I see really clearly that we really need more activist energy within government. The culture in government is really anti-change. And sometimes I need to be kind of held back too, so it's a good balance, but there's not enough activist energy at all. So I encourage you to consider getting involved. Not just by running for office, but also in bureaucratic regulatory positions that you may not have thought about before. Because there's a lot of unused power there to make change that currently people don't even know they have, let alone make use of. And if you were to combine that power with the activist ability to use it, to use every bit of power to its fullest extent, and to share that power with the people, that is where things can get transformed. So work smart, think big, aim high, and I will see you out there.
Hello, hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me? I'm going to make sure the chat is going well. Can you all hear me? Hello? Can everybody hear me? Welcome, 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 welcome. We're going to give it a few minutes while I get into my speech. Okay, all right, I'm getting some yeses. All right, okay, then we will go now that y'all can hear me. Hello, and welcome to the Canaanite Conference, the country's first Mid-Atlantic Cannabis Conference, sponsored by the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, the first and oldest association of Black journalists in the country, and the founding chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists, also known as NABJ. For those who don't know me, my name is Tahid Chappelle. I'm an executive board member of the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, and I'm a cannabis patient and a cannabis educator who's super, 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 super excited that this conference has finally launched. Although in a different form, we're finally here. We are finally here after a very long journey getting to this point. First off, before I get into the whole spiel, thank you to our corporate sponsors.
Now, 14 notifications.
We wouldn't have been able to pull this conference off in the first place, and we wouldn't have been able to make this conference free. Really appreciate the corporate sponsors, Expo Labs, Polis Industries, Soulful Cannabis, Minority Cannabis Business Association, and of course, our partners Uplift Maryland, who are going to be helping on the back end and the tech aspect of Hoppin. So if you ever need any help, look for Joelle. She will be around. We will both be here to help guys. Thank you all to the ticket holders, the vendors, the companies who stuck with us through thick and thin. Even though we are not physically gathering, we still decided to stick with the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists and support us. And so I want to say I recognize y'all and I really appreciate this ongoing support. First, a little bit of background for those who don't know PABJ. The Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, like I mentioned, is the first and oldest association of Black journalists in the country. We fight for equity and diversity in the media industry. We want to make sure that there's proper and adequate Black representation in commercial, nonprofit, and all forms of media. We want to make sure that the narratives are set and told by the Black perspective and by Black communities impacted by injustice and succeeding despite hardship. We want to ensure that we are empowering media entrepreneurs, content creators, communicators, those who want to or are interested in telling a story. The Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists wants to empower community members to own their voice, own their narrative, and speak truth to power. This association has been instrumental in helping me and supporting the Cannabis Conference as you are experiencing right now. A little bit of background in our involvement. In 2019, the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists successfully pulled off the first cannabis conference run by a Black media nonprofit called The Color of Cannabis, and it was based physically in Philadelphia. This conference was an opportunity to bring community activists, journalists, advocates, business people, those who had a stake or were just curious about cannabis into a room to talk about what could cannabis legalization mean for a city like Philadelphia. And for those who don't know, Philadelphia is a majority Black city, 44% Black population, and is also anchored by a 25% poverty rate. Most of those who are in poverty are from Black and brown communities. Philadelphia specifically has a lot to gain and a lot to lose when it comes to cannabis legalization. So the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists convened this large gathering of cannabis experts and those who are interested in the industry or the movement to talk about the impacts of legalization in Pennsylvania and around the region around Pennsylvania as well. It was highly successful. A lot of people came out. A lot of people got a lot more information than they had prepared for. A great thing. And we knew that there was a whole amount of interest around cannabis legalization, especially as it pertains to equity and justice, and of course, communities of color and Black journalists and Black community members as well. So we knew this was popular. It was very successful. And also I realized at the Color of Cannabis Conference, we had almost the entire Mid-Atlantic region represented. We were actually missing some people from, I think, Delaware and West Virginia, but if we had those two states represented, we would have actually had a regional conference. So lo and behold, we figured we can get people from those states and let's make this a official regional conference. So the Canaanite Cannabis Conference, as you see now, is the version 2.0 of the Color of Cannabis Conference. So really appreciate y'all being a part of this. Really appreciate y'all supporting this, this event. And I hope you are excited about this coming to life and learning today. So the Canaanite Conference is basically a regional cannabis conference talking about the impact of legalization as it pertains specifically to communities of color and those who have been impacted by the war on drugs. This is also a conference for journalists, media creators, people who want to tell stories within the cannabis space to ensure that we are telling the right information, the accurate information, and telling stories that are actually pertinent to the realities of legalization too. As Ricardo had mentioned, as Shalene had mentioned, as others have mentioned, information is important. The Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists recognizes that media played an instrumental role in changing, shaping, and warping public perception on cannabis. Despite the fact that cannabis was a medicine, despite the fact that cannabis was grown as an agricultural product called hemp or Indian hemp, cannabis had been used in the United States. But unfortunately, racist rhetoric and the close association of majority white newsrooms and media companies close to government officials, people with stakeholders and nefarious plans, the media ended up shaping and demonizing a thing called marijuana and shifting the public's perception on this plant. And because of that, laws were passed at the local and state and eventually the federal level, starting cannabis prohibition, starting drug prohibition, and passing what we now know as tough on crime, tough on drug laws. So the media industry has a lot to make up for telling a lot of misinformation and disinformation to the public. And so my hope is that during this entire conference, everybody learns, everyone feels empowered to learn a little bit more, and they help inform their communities with proper information grounded in science and research. So there's a little bit of housekeeping items for those who did not watch the walkthroughs, which I'm sure all of you watched the walkthrough videos. I know some of you did, so thank you for doing that. But for those who are new to hop in, what you're seeing right now is the main stage. This is where all the state of the state reports are going to be held. You will learn about Delaware, Maryland, New York, Virginia, DC, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. All those state of the state reports are going to happen here on this main stage. And every presenter is going to come on for a short Q&A portion after their presentation is done. So make sure you drop questions in the chat so that we can get some questions answered about particular states. If you are navigating the other parts of the Hopin platform, the reception is where you'll find the schedule so that you can find out what other programming is coming down the line. You can also make calendar invites for yourself too. So if you need to hop in and hop out, you can hop in and hop out. You can make a calendar invite for yourself and remind yourself that a particular session or state of state is coming up soon. Also, if you are going into the sessions are where the caucus rooms happen. We have state-specific caucus and networking lounges. So go there if you want to learn about people who are doing the hard work in the grassroots movement in Maryland. Go check out Maryland. If you want to know what's happening at the federal level in DC and what's going on with DC's cannabis market, head to DC. We made specific caucus and networking lounges for specific states within the Mid-Atlantic region so that we can get people to encourage and engage with people who are actually specifically in their states. We also made a general networking lounge too, so you can go over there, meet people, hang out, get on video, get on audio, have face-to-face conversations, and keep it relaxing and casual as well. The networking tab is basically a speed networking dating, like speed dating session where you can go and have random face-to-face conversations with people for about 5 minutes, and then you can decide whether or not you want to network with somebody afterwards. A little bit jarring, so that's why we had the open caucus room. So if you still want to have a random interaction with the person, check out the networking tab on your left. And then finally, the Expo tab. The Expo tab is where all the programming is going to be. That's where all the sessions are happening. That's where all the new programming that we're going to be talking about is there. There's a whole bunch of education in the Expo place. And also the vendor booths are also going to be there too. So you can check out some of the businesses that have set up a vendor booth as well. But the Expo session, you're going to learn a whole bunch of things from the state of cannabis media to the intersection of cannabis abolition to media reparations for Black communities, which is, I'm very excited about that one. That one's happening at 3 p.m. I got to plug that one in. Also, another housekeeping item, please drink water, please take a break, please relax, please be kind. This is a day of celebration. This is a day of relaxing. You're literally spending a Saturday with us, hanging out online. Please just relax and just enjoy yourself, take notes. Please be patient. We have a little bit of technical difficulties here and there. We're all trying to work this out as we go. So I appreciate your patience as we get things running and going. And then, of course, if you feel so comfortable, you may consume, as always. You can consume where you are. You do not have to feel comfortable. If you don't want to consume on video, if you're talking to somebody, you don't have to. Just know that no one's going to judge you. No one's going to harm you. This is a safe space. And as a cannabis patient myself, by all means, I feel okay. So hopefully you feel a little bit relaxed to engage with people, partake if you want, and just enjoy the overall conference experience. So with that being said, we are finally getting to the state of the states. Some of the sessions have now opened as I've been talking. Some of the sessions, both in the caucus and networking lounges, have opened, and some of the programming has opened as well. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining. I look forward to interacting with you all throughout the conference experience. You will see me pop in and out to do some live Q&As and whatnot too. But in either case, thank you so much for supporting the Canaanite Conference. Everybody, this is the country's first Mid-Atlantic Cannabis Conference. Thank you for being part of history. Thank you for supporting the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. And thank you for supporting Black journalists and Black media in general. So with that being said, I'm going to get myself off of this video. I'm going to get the Delaware State of State Cannabis Report going, and we're going to start the learning. All right, take care. Hello, and thank you for joining the Canaanite Conference, the country's first Mid-Atlantic Cannabis Conference, brought to you by the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. I'm Tahid Chappelle, and I'm an executive board member of the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. Today, we're going to be talking about Delaware's state cannabis market, and presenting Delaware's State of the State Cannabis Report is Zoe Patel, Executive Director for the Cannabis Advocacy Group, Delaware CAN. Get to learn what's happening in the first state. Take it away, Zoe.
Hi, my name is Zoe Patchell. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Delaware Cannabis Advocacy Network. I'm an activist, a cannabis advocate, and employed as a paralegal. I've been advocating for cannabis policy reform on a local, state, and federal level since 2010. In 2013, I helped co-found the local Delaware Normal Chapter, and that same year, we also co-founded Cannabis Bureau of Delaware, a grassroots citizen lobby group, which we inevitably incorporated as Delaware Cannabis Advocacy Network as an official 501c4 nonprofit in 2016. So Delaware CAN is focused on removing the civil and criminal penalties for cannabis offenses and legalizing cannabis for adults 21 and older to include expungement for past cannabis offenses, as well as robust consumer safety protections. Delaware doesn't have voter referendum like the other states that have legalized. So the only way to reform cannabis laws in Delaware is by directly lobbying our elected officials and going through the legislative process. So we formed Delaware CAN as a citizen lobbying organization to predominantly focus on legislative and policy reforms. Our main activities include direct action, citizen lobbying, and outreach. And to date, we've organized or participated in over 350 events since inception, including citizen days, town halls and public forums, expungement and pardon seminars, know your rights seminars, advocacy trainings, canvassing, event tabling, our annual 5K expungement fundraisers, and we regularly attend local political, civic, and community events to represent cannabis reform in the community. So media plays a rather large role in citizen advocacy, and we're extremely lucky to have receptive media organizations here in Delaware who frequently cover the cannabis policy reform movement. COVID has had somewhat of an impact on coverage with the lack of legislation and events, but if you Google Delaware cannabis right now for news stories, you will see evidence of our latest letter writing campaign, which is focused on highlighting the access problems with Delaware's medical cannabis program. So you see, we have some great letters to the editor written by members of our medical cannabis working group and other volunteers that have recently been published in Delaware's main media outlets. And there's also some coverage of the Delaware medical cannabis program now allowing home delivery for patients, which happened about a month after COVID. So Delaware cannabis policy reform efforts began in 2009, and we have certainly come a very long way with basically a decade of incremental reforms, beginning with the Medical Marijuana Act. The first version of the medical bill was introduced in 2009. Unfortunately, it was tabled in 2010, but another version was introduced and subsequently passed in 2011, which created the Medical Marijuana Act as we know it today. Unfortunately, the program was immediately met with many delays. The governor at the time immediately suspended the program. While the program began accepting patient applications and issuing cards in late 2012, it would be many, many years before the patients would have safe access in the form of compassion centers in the state of Delaware. So our organized advocacy efforts began in 2013 with the formation of Delaware Normal and Cannabis Bureau, which inevitably became Delaware CAN. And our first efforts were focused on trying to get the state to fully implement the 2011 medical program. So regulations for the medical program were promulgated in 2013, 2 years after the bill became a law. So you can see the immediate delay that the program has faced. Despite the law requiring 3 compassion centers to be open by 2013, the governor at the time unilaterally created what was known as a pilot program that licensed one single compassion center. That compassion center was located in Wilmington, which is basically like the most northern part of the state. And it created significant access issues for many of the patients throughout the state. Delaware isn't the biggest state, but it's big enough where placing one sole compassion center at the northernmost tip of the state forced patients to travel extremely long distances for safe access to their medicine. And it wasn't until 2017 that a second compassion center would open. And that same year, a third and fourth compassion center were licensed. Despite delay in implementation, over 24 amendments to the original Medical Marijuana Act have been introduced, and many of them have actually passed unanimously, including pediatric medical, known as Riley's Law, and led by Jay and Riley Nabler. We passed statewide decriminalization in 2015, which includes possession up to an ounce of cannabis. We also helped pass expungements for simple possession offenses in 2018. And we've been working on adult use, which was originally introduced in 2017. It passed committee that year, and then it carried over into the 2018 session, where it inevitably met its fate by failing by 4 votes because of the supermajority vote requirement. The second version of the adult use bill was introduced last year in 2019. It also passed committee 8-3. In the House, it carried over to the second half of the legislative session, which actually began the beginning of this year in 2020. But due to COVID, it unfortunately never got a vote and died at the end of the session. Just a brief background, Delaware's legislative session runs for 2 years, election year to election year, but the legislature only meets January through June 30th. This year, COVID claimed most of our legislative session, with many pending bills dying this past June 30th without ever getting a vote. While 2 medical amendments did pass in the first half of the session last year, medical home cultivation, adult use, and other cannabis reform bills were claimed by COVID. Unfortunately, the next available chance to pass adult use legalization and other cannabis policy reforms won't come until January 2021. So Delaware's medical program has exponentially grown over the years. Currently, there are over 10,000 registered medical cannabis patients, with over 12,000 active patient caregiver certifications in the state of Delaware. There are currently 6 classifications of medical certifications, including pediatric medical, known as Riley's Law, which allows pediatric patients access to high CBD, low THC cannabis oil that's capped at 7% THC. Like I said, that measure passed completely unanimously and was led by Jay and Riley Nabler. We also have adult medical, which currently allows certification for 16 qualifying conditions. There's also the compassionate use card, which allows doctors to recommend medical cannabis for ailments that are not covered by the qualifying conditions. However, it requires that applicants submit extensive documentation, as well as forces doctors to continue to follow up with the program about the eligibility of their patients. We also have the CBD Rich Only card, which actually passed earlier this year, which allows access to high CBD, low THC cannabis and cannabis products, also capped at 7% THC, eligible for those diagnosed with anxiety disorders. And there's also caregiver classifications for both pediatric and adult patients. Patients are able to possess up to 6 ounces at any given time. New conditions are added by petition or legislation. However, the petition process has been very unsuccessful over the years, where most ailments are added through legislation. To become a patient in Delaware, you must be a Delaware resident who's diagnosed with a qualifying illness and have a Delaware licensed doctor sign the medical marijuana application. The application, as well as the applicable medical records and $50 fee must be submitted to Delaware's medical marijuana program. And it typically takes about 2 weeks for approval. And then upon receiving the certification card, a patient can access any compassion center in the state. Unfortunately, there are currently only 3 providers in 6 locations statewide, which is causing significant access issues due to limited market participants here in Delaware. These access problems have only compounded since COVID and include serious supply issues, extremely limited and inconsistent product availability. Patients are forced to wait in long lines or have long wait times in order to purchase their medication. There's also very steep prices for medicine, which unfortunately is not covered by insurance here in Delaware, as well as patients being forced to purchase only small quantities at a time, and they're not able to purchase larger quantities like half ounces or ounces or anything that would help them stock up and not have to frequent the dispensaries as much. So the licensing process for new compassion centers is very tightly controlled. However, the program is now accepting new applications for the first time in years. Currently, right now, the deadline to apply is October 28th at 11 a.m. And includes a $5,000 non-refundable application fee. If selected, the applicant must pay a $20,000 registration fee to be licensed. And the program requires that compassion centers be vertically integrated. So a registered compassion center is responsible for the cultivation, manufacturing of any products like tincture, concentrates, and oils, as well as the sale of the product to the patient. Commercial kitchens to produce edible cannabis products were previously prohibited due to food safety laws here in Delaware. However, earlier this year, the regulations were written to allow for commercial kitchens. However, none of them have currently opened yet, mostly due to the vertical integration requirement that mandates that the compassion centers implement the commercial kitchens in-house in their current operations. So for whatever reason, they've not began that process. And it's definitely something that the patients need because they currently are unable to purchase edibles here in Delaware. Unfortunately, the program also does not allow for home cultivation. We are definitely working on efforts. Like I said, we had a bill that did not get a vote last year. The original law actually allowed for reciprocity for out-of-state patients. However, that provision was removed a few years back. Delivery is now allowed, which actually happened as a response to COVID. So it's definitely something that's somewhat of a silver lining throughout this process. Patients are able to request home delivery for their medicine. We are very fortunate to have very strong employee protection provisions included in the medical cannabis law. So patients who are fired from their employment due to being a medical cannabis patient actually have the right to sue their employer for wrongful termination in the state of Delaware. And there's actually been quite a few cases that have been successfully litigated in favor of the patient because of those strong employee protection provisions. There is also affirmative defense for patients who are not registered with the program, but have a qualifying ailment. So basically it provides protection from conviction if they are arrested for cannabis possession, as long as they're in the legal patient limit of 6 ounces. And thanks to case law litigated by one of our board members, attorney Adam Ledette, probationers can no longer be violated for using their medicine thanks to a judicial decision handed down in State versus Perry that allows probationers who are registered cannabis card holders to use their medical cannabis. So our current medical efforts include strengthening the medical cannabis program through regulatory and legislative changes, including home cultivation, resolving the access problems, removing qualifying conditions, increasing diverse market participants, as well as expanding the program. And HB 243 was the medical home cultivation bill, which was actually a Republican-led effort that was introduced in 2019. Unfortunately, it was tabled in committee this past January 2020 without ever seeing a vote. But it would have allowed patients to cultivate 6 mature and 6 immature plants. So our current efforts are focused primarily on adult use legalization and are being led by our all-volunteer citizen lobby team along with Delaware Normal. Unfortunately, we will need to wait until 2021 to pass adult use legalization. The latest version, as I mentioned earlier, was claimed by COVID and did not get a vote this year. But it was a Democrat-led bill that would have legalized 7 currently illegal acts. It ended probable cause for cannabis, so law enforcement wouldn't be able to search an individual based on the odor of cannabis alone. It also would have ended civil asset forfeiture for cannabis offenses. It included mandatory expungements and strong consumer safety protections. And it also required state agencies to connect programs with and to promote women, minority, and veteran-owned establishments. And applicants would be selected through a competitive scoring process based on family supportive opportunities offered, as well as their social responsibility and diversity plans that they submit in their application. So without voter initiative in our state, the election plays a very significant role in determining our success for any given legislative session. Our Vote for Cannabis campaign is our election-themed public education campaign focused on raising awareness, educating candidates and the public, and collecting and publicizing candidates' positions on cannabis policy reform. And we surveyed all General Assembly, gubernatorial, lieutenant governor, and Delaware congressional candidates on their position on legalization. And then we compiled their answers as well as incumbent voter histories into our 2020 Delaware Cannabis Voter Guide, which can be found at votecannabisde.org. While we are unable to vote directly on cannabis legalization here in Delaware, Delaware residents will be voting for those who will inevitably be voting on cannabis legalization in 2021. And without the voter initiative, it's important that the candidates elected to office support common sense cannabis policy reforms. So this is a big project that we focus on every election year, and you can go to votecannabisde.org to see candidate profiles and where Delaware candidates stand on cannabis legalization. Cannabis prohibition comes with a significant human cost, and legalization is so often overlooked as the significant social and criminal justice reform that it is. Cannabis prohibition is essentially the gateway to the criminal justice system, and decriminalization laws do not do much to fix that problem. Delaware has actually seen a 127% increase in possession-only court filings post-decriminalization, as well as a steep increase in police contact for cannabis. Cannabis possession-only offenses comprise 52% of all the arrests in the state of Delaware, and this does not include felony offenses like sales, manufacturing, cultivation, possession with intent, or any other felony charge. These are exclusively misdemeanor possession-only offenses or civil offenses. And on average, a possession-only offense occurs about 16 times a day or over 100 times a week here in the state of Delaware. While a majority of these offenses do result in a civil citation, since we passed decrim, the amount of police contact with citizens is a huge problem. It's not just the arrest that's the problem. It's any amount of police contact at all, as well as who's being charged with what and how the law is being enforced. There's also the probable cause aspect. Law enforcement is using cannabis as a tool to circumvent Fourth Amendment constitutional protections. So basically, the mere odor of either burnt or raw cannabis allows law enforcement to conduct what is called a probable cause search of an individual and their property based on either the real or imagined odor of cannabis. This is being severely abused by law enforcement, who would typically need to obtain a person's consent to search or would need to get a warrant from a judge. However, just saying that they smell cannabis gives them the ability to conduct a probable cause search completely without consent or without a warrant. And this is a very serious privacy and Fourth Amendment concern issue that does not get enough attention, especially here in the state of Delaware, where law enforcement who regularly lobby against our citizen-led efforts openly admit that this is the main reason to continue prohibition. Decrim is also being discretionarily enforced. While typically an ounce or less should result in a civil citation, we're seeing more and more cases of charge stacking and overcharging, which almost exclusively affects poor communities and communities of color. People with personal use amounts of cannabis are still being charged with misdemeanors or worse through a series of loopholes that law enforcement apply at their discretion. Most frequently used is what's called an aggravating offense, which allows law enforcement to make an arrest for an individual who's in possession of personal use amounts of cannabis if the offense has certain factors, such as where the cannabis was possessed. So for example, while possessing an ounce or less of cannabis is supposed to be a civil citation, if you had any amount of cannabis in your vehicle, police may choose to increase the charge to an aggravating offense and make an arrest instead of issue a ticket. And these are non-DUI related offenses where the person is simply transporting a personal use amount of cannabis in their vehicle. They're not smoking it, they're not under the influence. They're simply transporting the cannabis maybe in their center console or perhaps in their trunk or somewhere in their car, even in their pocket, but they're being charged with misdemeanor marijuana possession with an aggravating offense instead of being issued a civil citation. Law enforcement is also applying felony charges to simple possession offenses. So felony tampering of evidence charges are being discretionary applied for individuals who basically attempt to hide or destroy cannabis during a law enforcement interaction. So imagine you're at a party and for some reason police show up and you decide to toss the joint that you're smoking in the toilet or a sink. Law enforcement in Delaware are actually charging people, especially young Black adults, with felony tampering of evidence for trying to ditch their weed when the cops show up. And we've heard a lot of cases of this happening throughout the state and almost exclusively occur when it's a person of color. Other charge stacking includes felony conspiracy second charges for consumers that are busted during buys, as well as charges for endangering the welfare of a child, which is being applied even when the cannabis is secured in areas completely out of reach from children, which unlike most alcohol is kept in family homes. Yet people are still being charged with this extra charge for simple possession amounts. We're also seeing people with personal use amounts being charged with intent to deliver, even when no other evidence of drug dealing exists. Factors used to apply possession with intent include being in possession of nearly any amount of money, or being in what law enforcement have deemed high drug activity areas, or for simply being in possession of multiple packages of cannabis, despite the fact that everybody knows cannabis strains are typically sold in multiple packages to keep the strains separate. That's exactly how they're sold in the state licensed compassion centers. However, there are people that are being charged with felony intent because they have multiple packages. So basically, law enforcement will apply any additional charge to make an arrest instead of issue a civil citation. And this is happening entirely at their own discretion. Current civil asset forfeiture laws also allow police to seize money, property, and other assets for merely being in possession of cannabis and any amount of cash if it's in close proximity to one another. And like I said before, we see this almost exclusively applied to people of color. There's also the problem with person prohibited laws, which is a very serious problem that does not get enough attention. When an individual is convicted for a misdemeanor cannabis offense, they're considered a person prohibited from owning, possessing, or even touching a firearm or ammunition for a 5-year period. And these person prohibited offenses are very serious felony charges that can carry mandatory minimum jail sentences in Delaware. Many of the people that have a cannabis conviction may not even realize that they can be charged with a felony for even touching a gun due to their previous cannabis offense conviction. So no matter where you fall on the gun issue, cannabis should not be used as a tool to remove constitutionally protected rights from some, while others are free to exercise that right, especially when the penalties include long periods of incarceration for violators. Also, all felony cannabis offenses are considered violent felonies in the state of Delaware and are permanent and basically permanently make an individual a person prohibited. So all these offenses are applied at the complete discretion of law enforcement and are significantly disproportionately felt by poor communities and communities of color, basically creating a bifurcated system. According to the ACLU, Delaware ranks 15th highest in the nation for racial disparities in cannabis possession arrests, where African Americans in Delaware are actually 4.2 times more likely to be arrested than a white consumer, despite similar consumption rates across races. And we've only seen this increase since decriminalization. It actually really does not come as much surprise, given the fact that the history of cannabis prohibition was founded and has been perpetuated by racism decade after decade, with the collateral consequences essentially continuing to discreetly serve as an extenuation of Jim Crow laws. The American Bar Association cites 792 collateral consequences associated with arrest and conviction, including statutory and constitutional loss of rights and privileges, including loss of employment, loss of parental rights, loss of voting and gun ownership rights, restricted opportunities, including employment issues, restrictions on living in state and subsidized housing, disqualification from holding professional licenses, the loss of eligibility for federal student aid and loans, and a host of other consequences that make it very difficult for an individual to survive in today's society, let alone compete with their cohorts. So this is extremely problematic. Prohibition also comes with a staggering cost to the taxpayers, with millions of dollars wasted annually on these unnecessary arrests and police interactions. Cannabis prohibition is diverting law enforcement resources away from real public safety. So it's extremely important that we refocus law enforcement to focus only on real crime that has actual victims and reallocate all these resources to focus on helping Delaware citizens instead of holding them back. So here you can see the increase in possession-only offenses, with over 20,000 possession-only offenses post-decriminalization. And once again, it's important to note that cannabis prohibition is being used as a law enforcement tool and is more heavily enforced in poor and Black communities that are disproportionately feeling the effects of this harmful policy. These communities are being over-policed, which is more likely to result in arrest, and citizens are being overcharged, which is more likely to result in a conviction, which leaves an individual suffering from a lifelong collateral consequences as a result. We cannot afford to wait to end these police contacts and their arrests for cannabis. So while we're very close to passing cannabis legalization in Delaware, we are faced with a handful of hurdles and difficulties that we must overcome to pass this measure. And they include that Delaware does not have voter referendum. So legalization bill actually must pass the legislature with a 3/5 supermajority, whereas decriminalization and the medical amendments only need a simple majority. So this requires that we have bipartisan support for the legalization bills. And to overcome this major hurdle, we use direct action, citizen lobbying, monthly lobby days. We work through the election to try to get candidates that will support cannabis policy reform into office. And we also do canvassing and outreach activities in targeted districts. Another hurdle is that our governor is not supportive of legalization, unlike our neighbors in New Jersey and Pennsylvania that have a very supportive governor who's actually pushing for these reforms. So we have to educate our governor and lobby the governor's office. We use public pressure in the forms of calls and letter writing to help put pressure on the governor and educate him about the facts. And we also attend governor's town hall events and other public events to make sure that cannabis policy reform is represented, and we can try to lobby the governor at any of those events and educate him with the facts. So another issue that's rarely talked about here in Delaware is how 3 state agencies are currently impeding the process that determines the cost of implementation of legalization. So everybody knows, cannabis legalization generates revenue, so it would be a revenue positive or a revenue neutral bill. However, it does have some costs to the initial implementation. And unfortunately, 3 state agencies that are fundamentally opposed to cannabis legalization are actually in charge of various regulatory activities that give them the power to determine how much the cost of implementation is in the state of Delaware. So that's significantly complicating matters as they've padded what's called the fiscal mode. So to overcome that, we use direct action, citizen lobbying, once again, public pressure, calls and letters, coalition building, as well as strategic earned media. And perhaps the largest hurdle and difficulty to legalization right now is actually the significant, well-funded, powerful opponents to legalization, which includes over 20 organizations and corporations that oppose cannabis legalization, as well as 5 state agencies, and basically all of law enforcement agencies except for the FOP. And these well-funded organizations and corporations and state agencies obviously have funding to place paid lobbyists in our legislative hall to lobby our elected officials against the will of the 61% of Delaware voters that support legalization. So not only do Delaware citizens foot the bill for cannabis prohibition, but they're actually footing the bill to fund the agencies and some of the organizations to lobby against our citizen-led efforts. So in order to overcome that, we've built a coalition. We use strategic earned media. We organize public awareness campaigns and events, as well as public education and publishing research to counter the misinformation that is put out by the organizations and the agencies that are lobbying against our efforts. So some noteworthy Delaware facts. In living up to its name, Delaware was actually the very first state to garner a simple majority in a legislature for a legal cannabis market bill. Unfortunately, like I said, it requires a 3/5 supermajority, so that bill failed by 4 votes. However, we were the first in the state to get a simple majority, as all the other states that had legalized prior to that bill had done so via voter referendum, except for Vermont, who did pass legalization through the legislature, but that bill did not include a market. So leaving Delaware the first state to garner a simple majority on a cannabis market bill. It's also important to note Delaware, as the corporate capital of the country, will inevitably play a unique role in the continued growth of the cannabis industry as a whole, mainly due to its friendly corporation laws. While Delaware is not a legal state right now, and there are only 3 total licensed medical cannabis providers in Delaware, there are already many cannabis industry corporations that have incorporated in Delaware. So definitely keep an eye on Delaware for groundbreaking cannabis industry related corporate law court decisions from Delaware's world famous Chancery Court, especially as this fledgling industry carves its niche into the mainstream. We also have a solid majority of public support for legalization, and have had for just about a decade now here in Delaware, with the latest polls showing 61% support according to a 2018 University of Delaware poll. Delaware also has a very large pre-existing consumer base, with approximately 17.4% or 115,000 to 146,000 Delaware adults who admit to consuming cannabis, according to a self-reporting survey by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And those are just the ones who admit it. The current policy basically potentially places this rather large demographic of Delaware adults in danger of being exposed to the many harms of prohibition, including police contact, arrest, civil asset forfeiture, conviction, and of course, the many collateral consequences associated with arrest and conviction. So it's imperative that these arrests and the police contact end immediately. Lastly, Delaware is on the brink of legalization. We project Delaware to legalize in 2021. We believe it actually would have happened this year had it not been for COVID. However, we're actually even closer than ever before since Delaware's recent primary election. State politics decides the fate for legalization in Delaware, as well as other states that don't have voter referendum. So it's so important that people get out and register to vote, stay informed, and vote for cannabis in November. For more information, you can go to delawarecannabis.org. And to find out more information about how you can help Delaware be the next state to legalize.
Hello, everyone. If you are watching this live, we have just heard from Zoe about the Delaware State of State Cannabis Report, all things about the first state. I have to say, Zoe, you are watching this live. I think there's a little bit of feedback. Can you hear me, Zoe?
I can hear you.
Okay. So, you know, the first state is obviously, I think you had mentioned in your slide that Delaware was close to legalizing. That's true?
Yes, we are incredibly quick legalizing. We're on the brink of legalization. Do you think we would have actually passed legalization this past legislative session that ended on June 30th, had it not been for COVID? But basically, our session runs January to June 30th every year, and COVID took a big chunk of that. They weren't meeting in person. They were only doing virtual sessions at the end of session, like basically for the last like 3 or 4 weeks before the session ended. And they refused to take up quote unquote controversial issues that didn't you know, have some kind of impact. We argued obviously that there is a direct impact, both on, you know, two very relevant nationwide subjects right now, obviously the COVID recovery and, you know, creating jobs and things like that, and creating opportunities for people to be able to survive post pandemic and whatnot, and helping aid in the recovery efforts, as well as obviously, you know, the winning issue of like police contact,
increase contact with citizens and, you know, the effects of having overpriced communities, and obviously the racial disparities and things like that. So legalization would address those issues, but for whatever reason, they didn't take it up. But we're actually working with sponsors now, the current sponsors for the last bill, and in trying to negotiate different terms to strengthen that bill for the 2021 session, including, you know, increasing the equity pieces and the different provisions for expungement and things like that that are included in HB 110. And we're looking forward to a bill being introduced in January.
Everyone, I just wanted to give a quick introduction to Charlana. Charlana, do you mind giving giving viewers a quick
Hi, my
background?
audio is a little off.
That's all good. We can
Hi
hear you now.
guys, this is Charlene McKeithen here.
Hey, Carlana, thanks for joining us.
Charlana, can you give people a little bit of background information of who you are?
I'm sorry,
Can you give people a little bit of background information of who you are?
I'm Charlene McKeithen. I work with different organizations. One is with Zoe with Delaware, the chair of the development committee. I'm also the executive director of Garden State Normal in New Jersey. And a part of CAG, with a page without an E, Cannabis Advisory Group. I'm a part of that group also. And I'm an advocate, I'm a medical marijuana patient.
Thanks for coming on, Charlana. We were just talking about the fact that Delaware was close to legalizing in 2019, and it feels like it will be legalizing in 2021. I feel like if Zoe is pretty confident, there's a little bit of confidence behind there too. I'm going to ask a question that just came into one of our chats. Lynn Washington, who is a Delaware resident, asked if there are particular names of corporations or organizations that have been vocally or actively opposed to cannabis legalization. Are there any people that, or any organizations rather, that you can name that have been part of the opposition, so to speak?
Yes, so we have actually over 2 dozen either state, well, 5 state agencies and about 2 dozen nonprofit organizations that oppose cannabis legalization. We've actually formed a coalition, which is called Keep Delaware Safe and Healthy Coalition. And it includes AAA. So we recommend that people cancel their AAA membership as they continue to lobby different state legislatures, including New Jersey, Delaware, and a few others, to impede the legalization process. It also includes ATAC Delaware, Medical Society of Delaware, the Delaware State Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the largest predominant organizations pushing to thwart our citizen-led efforts here in Delaware. We also have almost every single law enforcement agency in Delaware opposed to this, who regularly show up to our different hearings and the different bill votes and whatnot in uniform with, you know, over 50 officers, you know, in almost like an intimidation like kind of tactic or whatever. Ironically, the SOP is actually neutral. So they're not lobbying against our efforts, but they're not also supporting them, obviously. But that was definitely something that occurred through lobbying those organizations as well. We also have, obviously, DuPont. We live in the state, the home state of DuPont. They've definitely had a hand. Nemours have actually opposed the pediatric provisions to the Medical Marijuana Act as well. So they've been definitely on the forefront of lobbying our elected officials to stop legalization. And there's actually 5 state agencies, 3 of which are actually tasked with a various form of regulatory activity post-legalization. So as I mentioned in my presentation, that's definitely been one of the biggest hurdles. So not only do Delaware taxpayers pay for the large cost of prohibition, which is estimated at $22.3 million here in Delaware annually, you know, that's the unnecessary arrests and different things like that. But they're also putting the bill for the state agencies that are hiring paid lobbyists to be at Legislative Hall lobbying our elected officials against our citizen-led efforts.
Charlana, I have a question for you. given that you are also involved in different parts of legalization efforts, one in New Jersey and in Delaware, how do you kind of go between, seeing what's happening in New Jersey, where there's going to be a vote in November, and seeing the movement in Delaware? What are some of the takeaways that you can tell audience members about your involvement and just seeing two different types of movements moving forward?
One of the big things with me is we have to advocate across state lines. Look at our situation with Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. And it's like when one state does something regarding legalization or medical, the other states try to follow behind or jump ahead of the state that's currently doing something. And us as advocates and even industry, we have to look at that, and we have to utilize that to help us do what we need to do as advocates and industry to get things done. The other thing is, we also, like, for example, with social equity, we need to look at what other states have already done, analyze that, and then put something together that works, a template that can work across the country and then be adjusted per state based upon that state laws and then local municipalities. So I think it's very important for us to support other advocates in other states, because that's what's going to help us get the job done. Also, in a situation like New Jersey, we started having problems with legislatures and kind of in-party disagreement. Well, what happens in South Jersey, Delaware looks at and South Jersey looks at what Delaware does, and it puts pressure on each other. So we have to really start looking at that aspect of trying to get things accomplished in this industry.
Charlana, Zoe, really appreciate your time, spending some time this morning with us. Really appreciate the information that has been shared about Delaware and what's happening in the first state. For those who are watching, we will move into the West Virginia state of the state shortly. I believe the Delaware School Caucus networking lounge will be open. It should be open right now. So with Zoe and Charlana, if you're going to be heading over there, hopefully some people are going to be hanging out there. If you're not in the caucus room now for Delaware and you are from Delaware, go check it out, go connect with some people, mix and mingle, and build some relationships. But Zoe, Charlana, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Tahid. Zoe, hugs and kisses. See you guys.
All right, I'm going to stop broadcasting, and then I'm going to bring up the West Virginia State of State report. Stand by. Hello, and thank you for joining the Canaanite Conference, the country's first Mid-Atlantic Cannabis Conference, brought to you by the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. If you're watching this session is about West Virginia's cannabis market. What's happening in the Mountain State? It's been a little bit of a sleep and maybe a little bit under the radar, but things seem to be picking up, and we will be learning about what's going on here thanks to our presenters, Danielle Waltz and Jesse Forbes. I will have them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about who they are, and then they will present the West Virginia State of State Cannabis Report. Danielle and Jesse, take it away. Thank you so much for supporting the Canaanite Conference, and thank you for presenting as well.
Well, Tahid, thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be here. I'm really pleased to be joined by Jesse Forbes, who I think is probably more of an expert in this area than I am. As you said, my name is Danielle Waltz, and I'm a member at Jackson Kelly, a law firm that's located in West Virginia, but we're also located in a number of other states. And how I've sort of ended up in this space is that our law firm has a significant amount of experience in Colorado, who, as we all know, has been leading the way in the marijuana space. So when West Virginia started looking at this issue, I began working with some of the attorneys out in Colorado to work to help shape the law here in West Virginia, and then also help clients navigate the different the permitting process, et cetera, and continue to work with local officials. So that's really the role that I've played in this space. We're excited to talk to you about sort of where we are in West Virginia with respect to marijuana law and where we might be going. And want to turn it over to my co-presenter, Jesse Forbes. So really excited again, who's here with us today.
Thanks, Danielle, and thanks, Tahid, for having us. As Danielle mentioned, my name's Jesse Forbes. I'm also an attorney in West Virginia. I'm located in Charleston, our capital city. And in 2017, I had the privilege of being appointed to the West Virginia Medical Cannabis Advisory Board by our state's governor. As Tahid mentioned, we have flown a little bit under the radar here in West Virginia. We're a small state and a fairly rural state, but we did enact a law in 2017 to allow medical cannabis. And I want to kind of address the current state of that and dive into some of the things that are on the slide here. But I did just want to give everyone kind of a background of how West Virginia got to where it is. And we've been moving relatively slowly since the enaction of the law, but that's due to some things that had to be changed and fixed locally through our legislature. But essentially, the law went into place in 2017, approving medical cannabis in the Mountain State. And it has still not been fully implemented as we sit here in 2020. The good news is that my understanding from a board meeting that we had last week is that the first of the permits for growers in West Virginia have now been scored, and the scores have been totaled, and the awards are going to be announced this week for the grower permits. We expect the processor and dispensary permits to move fairly quickly from that. And our state's Department of Health and Human Resources, which houses the Office of Medical Cannabis that's over top of the program per the code, has said that they expect the program to be fully operational by late spring of 2021. And so when we passed the law, we were the 29th state to have passed medical cannabis. I know that there's been several others since that time, but we still, West Virginia, unfortunately, a lot of times is the butt of some jokes of being last in a lot of things, and we're still likely, to be towards the middle of this and getting out ahead of a number of other states that haven't implemented this law yet. So we're happy with that. The progress right now is sort of rooted in the law, and I want to kind of walk everybody through how we got. So in 2017, we were really under the radar. It's my understanding there wasn't even really much of a national lobbying effort to bring medical cannabis into West Virginia. Our legislature has become very conservative over the last decade or so, and as a result of that, I think it was really thought by a lot of national folks and the people that have come to our board meetings that have reiterated this, that they didn't see West Virginia really even on the map as being a state that was likely to implement or legalize any form of cannabis. However, it really got traction and took hold in 2017 and passed the legislature, passed both houses, and was signed into law by the governor. The board was put in place to kind of review our law, compare it to other states, and see how it was viable moving forward. And there were unfortunately a number of issues with the law that was enacted. The major one had to do with banking and making sure that banks could comport with federal law so they could actually become operational. Initially, as the law was written, The state couldn't even take the application fees because they didn't have a place through the treasurer's office to deposit it that would have been legal and not gotten into trouble with any of the issues with the banks that the state used or jeopardize any of their federal status. So those things had to be fixed. There was also a major push for vertical integration. Our initial law only allowed a permit holder to be either a grower, a processor, or a distributor. You couldn't hold all three. And we had a lot of folks from the business end of this come to the board and I know reach out to various legislators about their concern about the viability of this as a business. One thing I think people that are at this conference might not quite understand is we are a very small state. We have about 1.8 million people. And we are also, unfortunately, I think at least in 2018, 2019, we were listed as the poorest state in the union. So that's one of those things that I think a lot of people don't quite realize about the status here. But there was real concerns about making sure that this was viable from a business perspective so that it could help the people that are suffering from the various conditions really get something that can help them. And so essentially the law had to be tweaked to allow for vertical integration. It was tweaked to allow to get the banking fix in place. And it was also tweaked through our legislature ultimately this year to allow for dry leaf forms of medical cannabis. The initial law did not allow that. Our board met a number of times early on, and we were actually charged with putting a report together for the legislature and governor. It was supposed to be there 2 years after the law actually did early because we saw the problem with the law, and so many people came to the board meetings, came to the West Virginia DHHR, where the Office of Medical Cannabis is, and expressed these concerns that we put our report out to the legislature early so they could start tackling these issues, and they did. That became something that became a bit of a political hot potato in some respects, particularly the dry leaf form, which was something that our board recommended. But ultimately, that's now been passed. It's the initial law allowed for medical cannabis cards to be provided by physicians that treat patients that had 15 conditions, ranging from Parkinson's disease to forms of cancer and other serious medical conditions that the legislature decided were appropriate for medical cannabis use. The physicians had to undergo additional training per the law, and actually the initial law even required a physician or a pharmacist to be on site at every dispensary during all hours of operation as medical cannabis would be dispensed. And a number of us on the board had concerns with that because physicians can't be in the business of prescribing cannabis per federal law. That gets into all the issues of whether or not they're doing something that runs afoul of federal law, and you have the physicians, obviously, the pharmacies are very concerned about maintaining the DEA certification. Marijuana is still a Schedule I drug federally. And so that was a major concern, and another thing that had to be taken out of the law and changed, and it was fixed by the legislature. But ultimately, there have been, I believe to date, there are 20-some physicians that have signed up to be able to prescribe medical cannabis, well, excuse me, not prescribe medical cannabis, certified patients, because they can't prescribe, certified patients for medical cannabis use. We expect that number will increase. My understanding is, and again, I'm on the advisory board, so the final decisions are made by our Department of Health and Human Resources Office of Medical Cannabis, which is under the executive branch. But my understanding from our last board meeting that we just had last week was they expect the doctors to start certifying patients and have cards beginning to be issued in March of 2021 for a full rollout of the program within a couple months of that. So they're expecting late spring of 2021. Our current law allows for 10 grower permits to be awarded. It allows for 10 processor permits and up to 100 dispensaries. And the dispensaries would be located in various geographical areas around the state of West Virginia, so long as a local county hasn't made a determination through their county commission or health department that they don't want a medical marijuana dispensary in their local county. But most of the counties have really stepped up and said that they're in agreement with the state law. And so we're hopeful that this is going to roll out and going to be in a position where really be able to help the people that need it starting in the spring of 2021, and also be in a position where the state may see some of the economic benefits. I mean, again, we're a very poor state, and a lot of the folks that have come to our meetings and stressed how they want to get involved in this industry are talking about the number of West Virginia jobs this may create. And I know that that's kind of a political issue that Danielle could probably speak better to the politics of it than I can. But it is an issue that we've seen people from all walks of the business community come in and really stress that they think this is something that they might be able to help people with, not just the patients that need it, which is obviously the paramount concern and what was talked about by the legislature and the governor at the time this was enacted, but also help folks in various areas that really do need jobs in this state. And so I know I may be jumping around a little bit on the slides, but I think that's a general status of the applications and timeline moving forward. The Office of Medical Cannabis itself was created by the Act, and that's housed within our Department of Health and Human Resources, which I mentioned is underneath the executive branch, and so it answers ultimately to the governor and the cabinet secretary of our DHHR. But the Medical Cannabis Office was created. The director was appointed fairly quickly, and most of their role thus far has been really trying to write the legislative rules for this process and write the format for the permit bidding process, and now they've been scoring and dealing with all of that. They've also done that with some changes to the administration in our state and some changes within the DHHR itself. We've had several chairs of the board of the advisory board for medical cannabis due to changeover that we've had over the last couple of years. And that's sort of a reflection of how long it's taken to get the program out. But again, that really goes back to the original bill not quite being ready for prime time. But it is now, and it's moving out. The other roles that the Office of Medical Cannabis has is they're implementing a seed to sale tracking system, which I know other states have done. I know that representatives of our legislature and DHHR here actually traveled to Colorado early on in this process to kind of see the tracking system that's in place there, and we're very impressed with it. As Danielle mentioned, that's kind of the forefront that everybody goes to is, Colorado's been doing this for how many years, and here we are. So they're going to be tracking from the seed all the way to the sale of every product. They're also going to be able to inspect the facilities that are licensed. They're going to be able to issue permits and revoke permits. And there's background checks, there's issues in terms of making sure that there's no one with criminal records and other issues there, so that these the medical cannabis is done in a safe way, and that's one of the things that we're concerned about. But it is something that we really do see rolling out in early 2021, and it's going to be a tremendous benefit, to the community. So I'm happy to kind of jump into any other areas, but I know there's some things that Danielle wanted to talk about, so maybe turn it back over to her.
Thank you, Jesse. I may cover some items that have already been covered by you, but I wanted to sort of talk about what's next. What are the obstacles in West Virginia? Why did it maybe take us so long to get where we are? And, how can we move forward? What are the strategies? What are things that have worked in West Virginia and what may not work? As you discussed earlier, one of the major issues, and I think it's not only true with banking, but it's also true with legal services, accounting services, and others, is that some of these businesses that were looking to come to West Virginia and set up were going to service providers and saying, give me some advice about how to comply with your tax laws, or what's legal in West Virginia. And the service providers weren't sure whether they were even able to provide the services. And part of that reason is we, have a U.S. attorney who's been vocal within his rights to do so, but has been vocal in his opposition to marijuana. And I think because of that, there has been a little bit of what I would describe as a scare effect. Even though West Virginia has passed a medical marijuana law, can we provide these services to these companies? What's it going to look like in the future? And so that, I think, has been part of why it's been slow. I also think, and some of you that are attending this conference may know this, but West Virginia is really at the center of the opioid crisis. And I think there, whether we like it or not, there is some concern of, is this going to be something else that is going to lead to additional issues for our residents? Or is it a solution? Is it something that may allow that not to become a problem for someone? So that's definitely an issue that I think it's difficult to navigate politically, and one you have to think about when you look at, moving the needle. And then of course, Jesse touched on this. West Virginia is become a very conservative state, with its elected officials. Their one United States senator is a Republican, the other is Democrat, pretty conservative Democrat. Right now, all three Congress people are Republicans. And then of course, the House and Senate in West Virginia are controlled by the Republican Party, and there's a Republican governor in West Virginia. I don't see that changing. I mean, I guess you never know, but I suspect that's probably going to look pretty similar after next election in West Virginia. And so, y'all might be sitting here thinking, well, wait a second, you're telling me this. What's the hope in West Virginia? Well, what I can say is the Republican legislature passed the medical marijuana bill in West Virginia. Now, did it come across I describe as a perfect storm, where you have folks that were strong advocates for marijuana, then you had Republicans who were strong free market people, and you had those folks band together and say, this is something that we want. And I think if you're looking for a pathway forward in West Virginia, it's going to require what I would say that same, bipartisan, where you have the free market Republicans that are getting together with advocates within the Democratic Party. And I think with that group, you can get it done. Jesse's point is well taken. West Virginia's economy isn't the best in the country. We would like it to be better, but it isn't necessarily, where we want it to be. And I think we're always looking for, new ways to say, how can we invite businesses West Virginia? How can we open our doors? And, this is a way where we can get investment in the state of West Virginia. And I think with the recent, push in Pennsylvania, so that's our neighbor. I don't see Ohio quite getting there yet, but I guess you never know. But with all of those things going on, there's going to be some pressure, I think, on the legislature to act on recreational marijuana. And I think that, as the members of the legislature who are elected become younger, I think party becomes less of an issue, because for young people, this issue isn't as polarizing as it can be for people who have maybe been around for 20 or 30 more years in elected office. I think as more young people get elected, it becomes less of a polarizing issue and more of what can we do to improve West Virginia's economy and how can we do that safely? And I think if we're able legislatively to be successful with the implementation of medical marijuana, even though it took a while, people see that this isn't a bad thing. They see the investment. They start seeing, the state making a little bit of money. They're going to say, you know what, maybe we can do this if we can do it safely. And here's what it would look like. So that's, sort of my hope for West Virginia. I think that it may not be next year. It may not be the year after. But I think if it's approached in the right way, you make the business case here. If you say, well, this is how the state is going to be able to move forward, there is a possibility. of getting it done. I don't know what you think about that, Jesse, but that's my take on where things are.
I agree with you. I think that's a good assessment of exactly where we are, but also in terms of moving forward, I think you're exactly right. And that's what we've seen really at the advisory board level. When we went around the state and had the initial meetings, it was amazing to see the number of folks that really were from the business community. And really, you would expect to have a very conservative outlook on it, but we're looking at it more from an economic impact potentially, and then also a conservative value, I guess, of having the government stay out of their business sort of idea. So I think there's some of that there. It is interesting with at least the U.S. Attorney in the southern half of West Virginia currently, because there's been some very, very distinct messaging coming out that has had that scare effect, in particular with firearms. And we are a state that is very, very pro gun rights. And what we've seen there from some of the messaging has been that habitual users of Schedule I drugs can lose their firearm rights and will be prosecuted federally for that. I've got a background in criminal law and have handled a lot of those types of cases over the years. And you don't see it often for marijuana, but that's been something that's been hinted at. Not just here, it's been other areas around the country. When the Cole memo was rescinded by Jeff Sessions, I mean, you saw that in other areas around the country where there was discussion of the impact on firearm rights, because you essentially are getting a card certifying that you have a medical condition you need this for, and you're going to be in a database track getting cannabis. And that may not be an issue in a lot of places, but in West Virginia, where people have a really, really strong background in hunting and shooting and things involving guns, it can be. And so that's something that is out there as well. And it's just sort of the state of our state anyway. But I think that those are things that definitely we need to be mindful of moving forward. And if there's going to be an appetite at the legislative level here to legalize recreational marijuana, this medical program really has got to show the state and show the legislature what it can do, what it can do for the economy. I mean, could we look like a Colorado? I'm from here, so I'm biased, but we're a beautiful state. We've got, as far as the East Coast goes, we've got some of the best ski resorts you're going to get within a drive of Philadelphia or a drive of Washington, D.C. We have great fishing, whitewater rafting. We have a lot of outdoor activities now. And obviously, we don't have 15,000 foot peaks, but we have nearly 5,000 foot peaks. And so, on the East Coast, that's something that we might be able to model after the Colorado image. And that's something I think people here really have an interest in exploring. And so it will be interesting to see how the legislature deals with it moving forward. But the medical cannabis has got to roll out, and they got to show that it's a safe product in terms of, it's not going to be out on the street. And, I have a background in criminal law, and you'd be amazed. I can tell you horror stories of people that have bought marijuana on the street thinking that's all they're buying, and find out that it's got some horrible substance laced in it, and then they're acting crazy for 3 days. And you're not going to see that here. I mean, you don't see it in Colorado because it is tracked from seed to sale. So it's a safer substance in a lot of ways, in that you're not out there buying an illegal street drug, particularly for cancer patients. So,
one of the things I was thinking as you were talking, and I think this will be probably another challenge to go from medical to recreational, and they've done it in other places. So, certainly it doesn't mean we can't do it here, but how do you convince the employer community that, who has West Virginia, for those that are listening, there can be some difficulty to find employees in certain areas who could pass a drug test. And so I think there could be concerns from the construction trade, the manufacturing trade, that, are we going to be able to find employees who, could pass a drug test? what does this increase our liability? Do we have to, take a look at testing a different way? Do we have to change our policies? So, kind of getting that community there at the same time, I think will be important, because if they're okay, then the argument that these people are going to be coming to work high isn't going to be as viable if the employer community buys that.
Well, and I think the medical could help with that in a way, because I mean, you're going to see a lot of these folks are going to be people with pretty debilitating conditions, likely in the workforce. But you're certainly going to have some effect on that. And I know that, it's like you said earlier, I mean, it's across every industry. You've got employers that have to worry about this. You've got, from the attorney community, there were some concerns on it ethically originally, whether attorneys could represent companies that wanted to get into this area. And there's been some varying opinions across the country on that, because there's some ethical rules that prohibit an attorney from helping a client engage in illegal activity. And it is still illegal federally, even if it's not prosecuted. So, there's a lot of things that we're in sort of a brave new world on, but hopefully seeing this come across might take away some of the concern that the employers have, or maybe it'll show them other concerns. But it certainly would be something that should be some food for thought for everybody moving forward. And this program is going to roll out here in early 2021, based on everything that I'm hearing. So I think that's where we're going to be. I don't know if we've covered all the slides at this point or not. I know we had 30 minutes. Tahid, how are we looking?
I think we're close to being able to wrap up. And what I would say, if there's a takeaway, is maybe don't sleep on West Virginia. That it took us a little longer. We might take a while rolling out, but keep your eyes on West Virginia. Watch these permits be awarded. Watch how the process goes. And if you're looking at a place to invest, maybe think about how you can move the needle in West Virginia. And certainly I'm optimistic. That's just my personality. I know there's kind of an uphill battle, but that I think that there is a possibility that you could get recreational passed here in West Virginia. And I hope for the future success of our medical marijuana program as it's rolled out.
Thanks, Danielle. I echo everything you just said. I think that's really right where we are. And hopefully we're going to see this program really kind of be a model for the potential that could come forward here in this state. And, I know we're running a little bit low on time. I tell people, if anyone wants to contact me, I know Tahid, I think, has our information. You can get through the conference, but you can find me on my website, ForbesLawWV.com. You can email me at wjforbes@ForbesLawWV.com. Give me a call if you want, 304-343-4050, or find me on Twitter and shoot me a tweet. So it's good talking to you. I'm sorry we couldn't all be there in person. I know this is strange times, but I at least got to take my mask off for 30 minutes here by myself in my office, and I'm going to put it back on here.
I'm going to close with my contact information real quick. dwaltz@jacksonkelly.com and 304-340-1160. Either of us would be thrilled to talk with you. We both love West Virginia. We'd like to talk about it, and we welcome your ideas on how we can move the needle in West Virginia also. So thank you so much, Tahid, for having us. Thank you, Jesse, for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you both for really laying the foundation and letting people know what's happening in West Virginia. Like I mentioned, West Virginia isn't on a lot of people's radars, but hopefully this will give people more information to pique their curiosity and find out more on how they can participate and get
a visit.
Yeah,
We'd love to have you visit.
Beautiful. A lot of outdoors, I've been told. It's a beautiful state. Thank you so much for presenting the West Virginia State of State Cannabis Report. We are going to be fielding questions from people who may have more questions about West Virginia and whatnot. So we will move to the live Q&A portion and see if anyone wants to ask any specific questions, or if y'all want to get a little bit on the topics, or just hype up West Virginia a little bit more. But for those who are watching this current session, this concludes the recorded version of our West Virginia State of State Cannabis Report. I'm Tahid Chappelle for Canaanite Conference, and thank you for tuning in. Hello, everyone. So you just heard the State of State Cannabis Report for West Virginia. We have one of the speakers, Jesse Forbes, here to talk a little bit more about what's going on in West Virginia. Jesse, thank you so much for joining on this Saturday.
Hey, happy to be here. Good morning or maybe afternoon at this point, everybody.
This day is going by so quickly. Everything feels like a blur. But real quick, I'm going to see if there's any other questions specifically for you and about West Virginia. And if not, I will certainly ask my own. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop a question in the chat and we'll bring that on. But Jesse, in terms of your hopes, I guess, do you think because the election is coming up in November that, there's a whole lot of interest in cannabis reform leading up to the election? Do you think that anything that happens in November is going to influence West Virginia's market at all?
I think there certainly is a potential for that. I mean, one thing that's alluded to or talked about by myself and Danielle was we do have a U.S. attorney in the Southern District here that's been very, very adamant about an opposition to marijuana generally. And there's been a lot of tweets about that subject, about the potential prosecution. And so obviously, depending on what happens nationally, in the event that Biden wins and we have a new U.S. attorney here, that very well might impact the appetite of the legislature as to what they would want to do. There's also some competitive races locally in the state legislature, and so there's a potential there. Although we talked about it in the presentation, I mean, I've grown up with pretty much all my life, other than I lived in North Carolina, but also my life in West Virginia. We were a Democratic stronghold. We were the state of John Rockefeller and Robert Byrd were our senators, and we've been historically Democratic registration and voted Democratic from the 1930s until about 10 years ago. And our current governor was actually elected as a Democrat. He was an ally of Joe Manchin, and he flipped and became a Republican about a year after he was elected and put his arms around Donald Trump. So there are things that can change both the national elections, and if some of the local people get some help here, it very well could change the makeup of the legislature and maybe a better appetite for passing recreational. So that's definitely something that's here, and we're looking at the election to see how it affects the appointments to the various U.S. attorneys here, how it could affect the local appetite for the legislature and their feelings. So yeah, I think the election is strong, although obviously from a presidential perspective, our state was overwhelmingly supportive of Donald Trump last night. And that seems to be what it's looking like right now, despite the Joe Biden side that I have pretty well. So.
In terms of your projections, what do you think the market's going to look like in terms of 2021? Do you think it's going to start off pretty smoothly? Do you think that things, I mean, we know that when markets or licenses are given out, the market is still starting to get up. There's always some sort of kerfuffle or some sort of, hurdle that kind of makes everything kind of start slower than people anticipated. Do you see this to be a smooth rollout?
Well, one thing that I'm hopeful about with that is that we have taken so long to roll it out that I'm really hopeful that most of those kinks have been ironed out, because there's been sort of a push by the people that passed the bill and then by the people who are trying to get the bids awarded to them to push this out and roll it out. I mean, these people have had warehouse space leased for a very long time to find out whether or not they're going to get a permit. So the fact that it has taken so long since the initial law was passed makes me hopeful that we'll be in a position where it really does run out smoothly. I know that they intend to start issuing cards to patients several months prior to actually having product in dispensaries. So I think that could be hopeful too. It certainly looks like the timeline now is late spring of 2021. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed for a very smooth transition into this actually going live in West Virginia.
Jesse, thank you so much for joining. We are running a little bit behind, so unfortunately we have to move forward with this, but I really appreciate your time here. Can you give people a little bit, just another second for how they can contact you and how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, sure. As I said, you can get on my website. I'm in Charleston, West Virginia. I'm an attorney here, ForbesLawWB.com. Email me, wjforbes@ForbesLawWB.com, or give me a call, 304-343-4050. Happy to talk to you about anything West Virginia related. And hopefully, as a result of maybe even this conference, with people around the region hearing about this, we'll get some more attention in West Virginia and really maybe look at ways that would potentially roll this out here. So give me a call or shoot me an email. I'm on Twitter, hit me on there, whatever makes sense to you. Thanks for having me, Tahid.
Of course, thank you for joining. Like I mentioned earlier in the introduction, West Virginia and Delaware were the two states that were not represented in last year's conference. So thank you for joining and making this regional conference whole now. For those who are watching right now, the Delaware and the West Virginia Caucus and networking lounges are open right now. So if you are from West Virginia or you're from Delaware, you can go check out those caucus and networking lounges right now. Go interact with people who are from West Virginia. Jesse, if you have some time to still stick around, if you want to check out the West Virginia Caucus and let people know that you're there, head into the sessions tab and you will find it as well. But if not, again, really appreciate your time and thank you again for sharing the state of the state.
Thanks for having me.
We are now going to move into the Virginia State of State Cannabis Report. That is led by Virginia Normal's Jen Michelle Padini. And after that, we will go into a little quick lunch break for people to relax, to stretch, to get some food, to re-up if you need to re-up. But we will move into the Virginia session. A quick little PSA for everybody as well who's watching the main stage. All of the expo booths, all the programming in the expo booths are actually all available and free. So the schedule will say the times that they are running, but theoretically you can go into the expo booth and click on any video whenever you want. If you are this is a PSA, if you are a speaker, a presenter, a panelist on any of these expo sessions, do check out your expo booth at the time that is on the schedule. Click on the video of your actual booth of your panel to watch it, and then let people know that you're in the chat as well. There's a little booth tab that everybody can interact with for a specific booth. And once your video is done playing, again, everyone has to manually click it on their own computer. Once your video is done playing, you as a speaker can toggle that video off and you can bring yourself live to answer any sort of questions and any sort of comments or anything like that. So if you are a speaker, if you're a programmer, or if you're a panelist, head into your expo booth at the time that is supposed to run. Make sure you let people know that you are there, and then bring yourself on live video so that you can answer and interact with anybody there too. Now, with that being said, we will move into the Virginia State of State report. I will stop broadcasting. I'll pull up that report and we'll get to it. Hello, and thank you for joining the Canaanite Conference, the country's first Mid-Atlantic Cannabis Conference brought to you by the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. Presenting Virginia's State of State Cannabis Report is Jen Michelle Tadine, NORML's Development Director. Learn what's happening in the Old Dominion State. Take it away, Jen Michelle.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I am Jen Michelle Tadine, Development Director for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Law, and I serve as the Executive Director of the State Affiliate Chapter, Virginia NORML. So let's get down to talking about Virginia and the state of cannabis here. Interestingly, we've had some really major progress in the past few years, and things are moving quite rapidly. I know that's not what you think about when you think of cannabis policy in Virginia, but friends, that is the honest truth. So here's kind of a little overview of what we've done in sort of the general history of cannabis policy in Virginia. Strangely enough, Virginia passed one of the nation's very first medical marijuana laws way back in 1979. Unfortunately, it uses the word prescription, so it's not really been too useful. Now, nothing really happened in the Old Dominion from 1979 until 2015, aside from preventing the repeal of that 1979 law and some work around mandatory minimums. In 2015, here, just like in many other parts of the country, we saw some fresh faces to the cannabis conversation. And this took the form of moms and dads and grandparents who really were asking for the allowance of some type of medical cannabis, generally for kids in their family and children with seizure disorders. And here in Virginia, their plight was powerful. Their stories were moving, and they brought to the forefront of this issue people, children primarily, that really anyone could connect with. It can be difficult to, from a legislative standpoint, to really connect with an adult's pain and suffering, but children, that's something that everyone can really connect with, the suffering of a child. And it was very powerful here in Virginia. And so then at that time, conservative controlled legislature passed what's called an affirmative defense, meaning it wasn't legal, but if you were caught in possession of certain types of medical cannabis products here, you had a certificate that said, okay, you can submit this as your defense in court and the case can be dismissed. And we all high-fived ourselves and said, thank you so much. However, we can't stop here. This isn't really a public policy solution. So we came back in 2016 and said, listen, we've essentially told people that in order to use this certificate, they have to engage in interstate drug trafficking, and that's not okay. We need to make these medicines here in the state of Virginia. And the state was like, we'll see about that. Why don't you come back next year in 2017 and present what you've put together for that? And we did, and it was approved. And that really opened the gate for us to start engaging in the regulatory process for cannabis here in the Commonwealth. In 2018, we came back and said, perhaps we shouldn't have the state legislature decide which diseases are appropriate for this program. How about we just let doctors decide? And interestingly enough, the legislature agreed. So we removed qualifying conditions in 2018, and in 2019 came back and got even more progressive. We passed school use, becoming the 4th state in the country to allow registered student patients to use medical cannabis products on school grounds. Pretty progressive for the Old Dominion. We formed the nation's 2nd state-level cannabis caucus, and our Attorney General hosted in conjunction with the caucus the state's first cannabis summit. Here we are in 2020, and we had a whirlwind session at the beginning of the year in which we decriminalized personal possession, we legalized our medical cannabis program, no more affirmative defense. We also defelonized concentrates and allowed the addition of more dispensaries. So let's go ahead and look at sort of the most exciting thing that we've done this year, which is decriminalization. Virginia surprisingly has one of the lowest decriminalization fines in the country at $25. This is prepayable like a traffic ticket, and what is in code right now is that up to 1 ounce of marijuana, as it is in code here, is presumed to be for personal use. This includes not just flower, but products that were previously considered hashish. Any amount of hashish possession prior to the passage of this law was a felony. So we did defelonize concentrates by removing hashish from criminal code with the passage of our decriminalization laws. All misdemeanor records, any records associated with misdemeanor possession, both retrospectively and prospectively, those can all be sealed and are in the process of being sealed right now by Virginia State Police. The only reporting that happens with the $25 civil penalty is to the Department of Motor Vehicles if someone holds a commercial driver's license. And we added in to the enactment language in the decriminalization bills that we should have a legislative work group to discuss how the state should legalize and regulate adult use if and when it chooses to do so. And we're in that process right now. So here's a quick peek at Governor Ralph Northam's Virginia Marijuana Legalization Work Group webpage. You can see that it was convened by 2 acts of assembly, 2 legislative efforts convened this legislative work group, of which I am a member, and we are about midway through the process of having these conversations. The legalization work group is really intended to build consensus and have the tough conversations before we get into the next General Assembly amongst administrative and regulatory stakeholders. We also had a study done, and that study report is being put together right now. Not only do we have the work group, but we also have the study, and this is being done by the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission. And the study objectives are very similar to the work group discussion topics, where it is really helping us identify what the best regulatory model would be for the states, how we would best go about in engaging in restorative justice, and what have other states done that has been successful, what lessons can we learn, what is the best tax rate, what is the best density for dispensaries, all of the big questions that we really want answered before we get back into the 2021 General Assembly and have to introduce comprehensive legislation to legalize and regulate responsible adult use of cannabis in Virginia. So this work group, this study, the legalization studies report, will be completed in November, and the work group's report will coincide with that as well. All right, now we have our medical cannabis program that's been off and running really since about 2017, and it's sometimes confusing from those looking from the outside in, what the heck really is Virginia doing down there? So our program right now is extraction based. So that means patients can't get botanical cannabis at the dispensaries. They can get a wide range of products that are made from the plant's extracts. So oils, capsules, gels, tinctures, lozenges, suppositories, gelatin cubes, and inhalation products as well. Just not botanical cannabis. Our medical cannabis program is currently regulated by the Virginia Board of Pharmacy. So patients will see a pharmacist when they come into our dispensaries. Like the extraction-based part, this is not a unique model. There are other states that have started and still remain extraction-based. So that is not likely how Virginia's program will continue. And there are other states that use a pharmacy regulatory model or have pharmacists involved with the process. That part of it is likely to stay in Virginia, at least for the foreseeable future. It really is an added value to patients. Again, any condition, and we do have some of the nation's strictest consumer safety testing protocols in place. In addition to that, we have some minimums and maximums. And the minimums really came about because it was intended to ensure that the products being dispensed actually had cannabinoids in them. So each dose, which means one single dispensed unit, one puff, one dropper full, one tablet, for example, has to have 5 milligrams of either CBD or 5 milligrams of THCA. And each dose, each single unit, may contain up to 10 milligrams of THC. This number is based entirely upon the sort of general standard across the country for adult use edible products. So not too unique there. And yeah, so we right now have a vertically integrated model, meaning everything is licensed under one license: cultivation, extraction, product formulation, dispensing, and even delivery. Yes, we do have delivery allowed. Here in Virginia, we didn't have to struggle with that once COVID hit. It was already in place. We have 5 health service areas in the state. That was already a structure that was in place. And so in the initial rollout of this program, the then conservative controlled legislature decided that we would allow 1 pharmaceutical processor per health service area. And yes, that is the name that our vertically integrated medical cannabis licensees have been given or were given back in the day when this started. It has nothing to do with pharmaceuticals. It just happens to be a really weird name that everyone was emotionally comfortable with at that time. Again, not anything to do with pharmaceuticals other than they're meeting those sorts of quality standards in general. So at this time, while there are 5 HSAs, I will point out that there are only 4 licensees in place, and the 5th license is going to be revisited this year with a new request for applications by the Board of Pharmacy. This is likely to be the last licensing round that happens under the initial model. Now, this year we did also pass legislation that will allow the existing licensees to have 5 additional retail sites. So these will be called Cannabis Dispensing. Wow, look at that difference between when we started with this back in 2017 and had to call them pharmaceutical processors, and now in 2020, we're calling them cannabis dispensing facilities. So each of the original licensees will be able to have an additional 5 retail-only sites within their health service area. Under the existing model, this gives us the potential for 30 total retail locations, including both the vertical facilities. However, one can't really imagine that 30 dispensaries is enough for the state of Virginia. So we are going to see legislation again in 2021 that will expand that. Patients have to register here in Virginia for the medical cannabis program, as they do in the majority of states that are regulating medical access. It's pretty straightforward, and they get the written certification by a registered practitioner. They are allowed to use telehealth to do so. While we did have telehealth in place, it was still a little clunky. COVID sped that right up, and so right now, patients are able to use telehealth from the convenience of their homes to get their patient registrations in place, their certifications, and then they will register with the Department of Health Professions, pay their annual $50 registration fee, and get their card in the mail, which here is a piece of paper. It is not a plastic card like some other states are using. Practitioners also have to register. They use the exact same website that patients do through the Department of Health Professions. In Virginia, our practitioners are defined as being an MD, a DO, a nurse practitioner, or a physician assistant who is licensed to practice medicine in the state of Virginia, and they also pay a $50 annual registration fee. Now, patients who are not minors or who do not have a legal guardian as an adult, they were sort of left out as they might be able to access the facilities or their medicine if they are unable to physically visit a pharmaceutical processor as is required in person for the initial visit, or able to answer the door to receive their deliveries as they are able to get deliveries for their refills after their initial visit. So we did craft language to identify what a registered agent is, and this is again for people who are adults, who don't have a legal guardian. They can appoint an individual, and a registered agent can serve no more than 2 patients, but then they would be able to go to the facility for the patient or answer the door and receive the patient's medicine on their behalf. They pay a $25 registration fee. And also we have authorized school use, of course, as I mentioned earlier. This is able to be administered by any individual who is granted the authority to administer healthcare services by the school board. What the law really does is eliminates that required expulsion and suspension that was previously in place for the possession of marijuana on school grounds. And it's simply treated the way any other, any prescription medication or over-the-counter medication that student has to take while on campus or at a school activity, although it comes with its own special form. And you know, I think it's exciting that Virginia was progressive on that issue. So what are we looking forward to here in Virginia? We are looking forward to moving swiftly to legalize and regulate adult use. We have legislation moving through a special session of the Virginia General Assembly, which is happening right now, that will bring expungements to Virginia. We don't really have expungements in the state right now. We're one of only 8 states that doesn't. Outside of those who are found not guilty or have had their case otherwise dismissed, those are really the only people who can have records expunged at this point. So we're really looking forward to some legislation succeeding in this special session, which we'll be wrapping up here in the next probably 2 weeks, and really moving forward with an expungement process in Virginia. And we will take continued action to improve upon that, and are really looking to speed up the timeline for expunging past marijuana records. And of course, we will see continued effort, as we have every year since 2015, to improve and expand our medical cannabis program. So that's what's happening here in the Commonwealth with medical cannabis. Fahid, thanks so much for having me on to have this conversation.
And that was Jen Michelle Fedini, who will be joining us very shortly for a Q&A to talk a little bit more about Virginia. So if you have any questions around Virginia's cannabis market, please feel free to drop them into the chat. You can drop them into the stage portion as well. Jen Michelle, I'm going to bring you on board and see if we can get you in here.
Hey everyone, nice to see you this morning.
Hey, thanks for joining. Let's see first if there are any outstanding questions in the stage or in the event channel. Okay. Looks like we don't have any questions right now, but if you do have any questions about Virginia, feel free to drop the chat. Jen, I wanted to kind of touch base a little bit. Someone had said this earlier, that you know, things that are happening outside of other states, they do play some sort of influence sometimes. And kind of encouraging advocates or activists to push the needle and move the needle one way. Has there been that kind of conversation in Virginia, or do you think Virginia is a little bit more insulated and kind of working on its own without looking around the Mid-Atlantic region or other states?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Zahid, one I've heard a few times before. And it has been largely dependent upon the party asking the question, honestly. I think that has been influential in some of the positions for our Democratic legislators, but very much less so for our friends on the Republican side of the aisle. They seem much less concerned with what the District of Columbia or Maryland might be doing. And so yeah, it's played a role, but not as much as you really would expect. However, that being said, I think that Virginia's most recent progressive action in the past couple of years has played a role in influencing policies or at least activism in our states to the south.
In terms of, optimism, given the momentum that you have been building in Virginia, where do you see the market looking like, 1 year from now, in September 2021? Where do you hope the market is by the time we have this conversation next year?
Well, I think it's reasonable to expect that we will see some legislation in the 21 General Assembly, which starts in November, succeed to expand licensure in the medical cannabis regulatory structure and really improve upon that, hopefully moving it away from the required vertical model to a more tiered model, lowering barriers to entry, particularly as it relates to capital. The kind of $1 million question is, will Virginia be able to adult use in 2021? And there are a number of sort of steps that have to be taken in advance of a really large policy step like that. If we're checking all of those boxes. We've got the JLARC study, we've got the legislative work group, which is very much a belt and suspenders approach. And there is a Democratic majority at this point in both the House and the Senate, and the administration is Democratic as well. So, sort of all the things that would need to be in place to pass such a bill are there. It's really incumbent upon Virginians at this point to contact their lawmakers and let them know this is a priority for them in the 2021 General Assembly, because we have elections every year here in Virginia. And in the November general election, the entire state legislature is up for grabs. So if there's a shift in the majority in any, either the administration or either chambers, without that sort of trifecta of agreement, it will be much, much harder to advance adult use legislation. And really, it could be another 2 or more years before Virginia has the opportunity to hear such a bill again. So
wow, really?
Yeah.
Wow. I was gonna bring up the election, the November election. It's gonna be a pretty big, impactful thing for Virginia to consider, right?
It is. This election in particular will influence what voters do when they head to the voting booths next November in 2021 to elect our state legislature, and that's where we could see a swing in the opposite direction of where we are now, or we could see continued Democratic control, and that Democratic control, not to sound partisan, has really been what has created the pathway for these more progressive reforms. You can see prior to that, our steps had been pretty small, impactful, but very small and measured steps. And now we're able to take these much larger strides forward.
And last, but certainly not least, can you repeat how people can connect with you, can support Virginia NORML, and to find more information?
Absolutely. So I dropped a few links in the chat that link to the Virginia Marijuana Legalization Work Group page on Governor Northam's website. I put a link to our frequently asked questions page on Virginia NORML. If you have any interest in seeing exactly how our medical cannabis program or our decriminalization laws work here in the state. And if you're looking to connect with me, it's real easy. You can always get me at chapters@normal, NORML.org.
That's super easy. Jen Michelle, thank you again for joining us. For those who are watching, I believe the Virginia Caucus and Networking Lounge should be available right now. If not, it will be after our little lunch break. But stay tuned and check the schedule for when it goes live. Hopefully, Jen Michelle, if you're able to join for a couple more minutes later today to answer any sort of outstanding questions or just interact with some other Virginians, that would be great. But otherwise, thank you again for delivering your state of state report, and I appreciate all the work that you've been doing.
Thanks so much for having me, Tahid. It's been a pleasure.
Take care. So we are now in the midway portion of the programming. We are going to be hitting our lunch break relatively soon, actually a little bit earlier on schedule, about 4 minutes ahead of schedule, which is great. So for those who are watching the main stage, again, all of the expo sessions are available for you to watch. You can go into any booth within the expo and click on a video, a pre-recorded video, and it will bring up the current session. For those who are speakers, panelists of your actual specific booth, we want to let you know to go into your booth at your actual stage time on the schedule. Let people know that you're in your expo booth watching the video with them. And if you are a speaker or a panelist, you will be able to switch that booth from the pre-recorded video to the live Q&A version, where you're able to bring yourself onto video, onto audio, and talk directly to people. All the speakers and panelists will have and should have that power to do that within their booths. So just make sure to check the schedule, let people know that you're in the booth, and when the video is done playing, which anyone can click on the video on their own, when you are ready to go live to do your Q&A closer to the end of your scheduled session, please do so. For now, we are going to go into lunch mode. So for those who want to get some lunch, get some food, stretch, what have you, we're going to return to the main stage at 1:30. In between now and then, we are going to play a very short Q&A with some Pennsylvania politicians to talk about current legalization efforts happening in Pennsylvania and why legalization is so important, not just for Pennsylvania, but for Black communities in Philadelphia. So we will continue on with the show. Thank you for watching.
So I think there's different levels of impact that full legalization will have on the African American community. One, from a criminal justice space, you'll see less arrests, less stopping, less searching of Black and brown people because of cannabis possession. No more, I smell cannabis, let me search your vehicle, none of that stuff. In addition to that, though, there are financial impacts. I think should African Americans get into the cannabis space, and not just from a working perspective as an employee, but from our ownership perspective, we could see a positive financial impact in cannabis. As far as cannabis on a larger scale, with the resources coming in, we estimate, it could be somewhere upwards of $500 million. In my view, there are a lot of ways to invest those dollars right back into Black and brown communities.
Well, I think it will be tremendous, primarily because African American and communities of colors have been disproportionately impacted by the failed war on drugs. So as we've seen across the Commonwealth, across the country, when states have moved to legalize adult use cannabis, we've seen many times in those states a reduction in communities of colors being penalized criminally for it. So we believe the same thing could happen here in Pennsylvania.
My short answer is I have no earthly idea, because ultimately God is in the details, and we could pass an awful bill. We could enact a law that does very little to improve the lives of Black folk who've been disproportionately impacted and intentionally and explicitly targeted in the war on drugs. Or we could pass something that puts all the other states to shame. My hope and my commitment is to the latter, to learn from the mistakes and the leadership of other state legislatures. That is absolutely something I'm committed to. There is not one way to legalize cannabis. I was not in office when medical cannabis was legalized. I am a medical cannabis patient. So from my consumer experience, I see a lot of issues with the current law and that need addressing. So I'm hoping that those things will be addressed with regard to any bills that come up in the next term. But I believe that this is something that we should be committed to, but first and foremost, from an equity-centered position, and as it relates to public health, community safety, and addressing wealth and other forms of inequality, largely based on race. So I have no interest in facilitating rich white men getting richer off of cannabis. That is not an interest of mine. I am deeply disinterested in that approach. I'm also not interested in legalizing cannabis if all it does is to generate tax revenues that go to the general fund to be used by electeds for whatever pet projects they have, and not in furtherance of racial, economic, social justice. So if it's just a means to generate a lot more tax revenue for electeds to play with, not interested.
Well, I think one of the ways that cannabis legalization can help with police reform is that, one, you'll have less police contact. So, a police officer pulling you over and saying they smell marijuana and therefore searching the vehicle, those days will be over. Police, just patting you down and finding marijuana on you and arresting you for those things, those days would be over. But I think on a larger scale, just changing the mindset of how people view cannabis in our communities will definitely help with police community interaction.
So legalizing cannabis, we believe, opens up a wonderful possibility, because in bills that are before us, particularly in House Bill 2050, which is my bill, we have criminal justice reform in there for people who have been impacted negatively, have criminal records, or maybe even sitting in our correctional facilities. they will automatically be released. Their records will automatically be expunged. Their licenses, either professional or driving licenses, will be returned. The onus would be on the state to kind of identify those folks, help them through the process. We are putting money aside for the departments to do that. And so we think it would be a wonderful opportunity to kind of reform our criminal justice system. And it opens up our facilities and our law enforcement to focus on more serious related crimes.
It does have a particularly interesting potential impact on policing, which of course we're talking quite a lot about, given all the civil unrest and the wonderful mass protests around the Commonwealth and around the world. If we legalize it, we create an opportunity to divest law enforcement from getting in our business. And as long as we are using it as the law provides, then leave us the hell alone. This should not be something that law enforcement should be involved in. If we are using it as the law provides, it will be a particular benefit if we divest in all the traffic enforcement that law enforcement agencies commit to. If there's a disconnection between law enforcement and traffic enforcement, which I think is something we really should look at, then there are fewer opportunities for police who have personal opinions against cannabis and other drugs to have an intervention to take things to the next level and escalate things and put people in the criminal justice system who have no business being there. So that's something that I think is a potential upside if we do this right.
Well, for me, the war on drugs was nothing but the war on poor people. And cannabis legalization will mean that we as a country have taken a wholesale shift on how we see cannabis, from drug to medicine to something that could be recreationally used. But what we can't allow to happen is we can't allow cannabis legalization to happen without the restorative justice component to it. There has to be a restoration of all of the folks who were negatively impacted by cannabis in our Commonwealth. So that's expunging criminal records. That's quite honestly, I would go as far as saying, full pardons, removing it totally from a person's record. And for me, I would look at how can we provide tax credits, incentives, grants, or whatnot to those who have been negatively impacted by our cannabis laws, so that they can be a part of the business aspect of this growing economy. Should we fully legalize cannabis?
I think having this conversation is timely, as we're seeing across the world, a readjustment to all of the systemic and institutionalized racism and dynamics around the country and that space. So with having this legalization question around cannabis, I think gives us also a chance to reinvest and reimagine what it means to be equitable in the Commonwealth. And so in bills that we've been talking about that's before us, we are looking to put resources into making sure there's access for communities of color to have licenses in the new space and the new industry. We're looking to put money into building capacity into communities of color for business opportunities or for social opportunities. So we think this is a great moment in time and will be tremendous for really continue the conversation around equity and inclusion.
As I mentioned on the front end, to me, my focus and my interest is about creating policy around cannabis that is centered on equity, social equity. So that's not just how it impacts Black and brown folk, who were the original boogeymen, which facilitated the longstanding prohibition of cannabis. If you were Mexican American or African American, you were the boogeymen. You were the poster boys for wacky tobacco, for Mary Jane, for this drug, this plant that white elected officials wanted to ban for political reasons and used us as bait. So if it's not equity-based, I'm gonna have a real problem. And I don't care if Republicans are in power or Democrats in power. This is a justice issue. And that means that all the people who are locked up in cages related to for drug-related offenses, they should be freed, and their records should be expunged, because they're incarcerated for what rich white guys are getting richer off of. And that is deeply problematic. That is unjust, to say the very least. And we have to make sure that there are entrepreneurial opportunities in the cannabis industry for all, so that we can begin to address this massive wealth gap between Black and white. If it doesn't create significant financial wealth for not just individuals from historically disadvantaged communities, individually and also collectively, then we haven't done our job. Because there are any number of industries that have lobbyists who have created a new class of wealthy folk intentionally. And I believe that if there's any area for reparations, it needs to be one that is fueled by the extraordinary growth of legal cannabis. So if there's not a reparations type of perspective around this, then I'm gonna have a problem. And I know that's a controversial term, but these are controversial issues. And this is what justice looks like: to not connect the financial opportunities with the communities who are on the front lines, the victims of the war on drugs. Then we've missed a real opportunity, and we should be held accountable for that by the public.
Well, first thing the public can do is call your legislator and let them know where you stand on the legalization of adult use cannabis. That's one. The second thing is be direct in your request. We need to hear from you that you agree that we should not legalize cannabis unless we're doing it the right way. The right way means legalization. The right way means a home grow. The right way means the restorative justice and fixing criminal records. The right way means making sure that African Americans have an opportunity to not just be workers, but be owners. So that means you might have to, lower what is necessary to get in to owning a dispensary, to owning a grower processor facility. To the future, let's look at how we're training our young people to work in the cannabis industry. How are we training them in hydroponics? How are we training them in growing? How are we training them a whole lot of other things that will benefit them in the future with regards to the cannabis industry? Thank you again for having me. I'm State Representative Jordan Harris of the 186th District, House Democratic Whip. Hopefully soon, we will legalize cannabis in Pennsylvania.
I think continue to push us to address the issue. I think the Lieutenant Governor did a 67 county tour talking about this, where well over 60% of the Commonwealth citizens said that it was time for us to legalize cannabis, adult use cannabis. I think there have been other studies that have come out recently, even in conservative areas where citizens of Pennsylvania have said the time is now for us to legalize cannabis. I think citizens have to continue to advocate that for themselves. They have to write letters, they have to email us, they have to make calls, they have to do the things that you're doing here, hold conferences, write op-ed pieces. But I think with your help, we will move this assembly. And you heard the governors already have called for us in this budget year to try to figure out a way to legalize adult use. I think the time is now. I think with your help, your advocacy, and your continued push, we will get this done.
One is use the right language. Don't use your enemy's language, because whatever side of the issue you're on, you use your enemy's language, they win. We also have to make sure that however we talk about it, that we centered on justice, on social equity. third is that we roll up our sleeves. We listen to what's being talked about in Harrisburg, in City Hall, in Congress about this issue. Train ourselves. We have to be knowledgeable and mobilize around influencing the electeds who are going to be at the table, who decide what these pieces of legislation look like, to make sure that our interests are represented in the bill that will ultimately be enacted into law. So that's my piece. Thanks so much. And I look forward to continuing this discussion.
Hello, everyone. You have just heard a couple of politicians talk about what legalization can mean in Pennsylvania. There's a lot riding in this state, and so there is a large opportunity for people to get involved in Pennsylvania. And as you heard, you have elected officials, you have people who represent you. So we are going to be talking a little bit more about the current state of Pennsylvania a little bit later in today's programming. For now, we are currently at a lunch break, and I believe that at 1:30 we should have DC's State of State report coming up, and that will be live streamed here as well. So for the time being, we have a good 30 more minutes or so to relax. Enjoy the caucus rooms as well. I'm going to head to the caucus rooms as well and check in. Check out the expo, check out the vendor booths. We have a lot of vendors there who are talking about their products and their services. Also in the expo session, you can find all of the programs that are available. Check the schedule to see what time they theoretically should be playing. Usually at the last 15 minutes of the scheduled programming after the video is done, we are going to try to have the speakers go on live to talk to you, to talk to your, or answer any of your questions or anything like that. So if you're a speaker, a panelist, please check your schedule, see what time your session should be running in the expo booth. Head there, play that video. Anyone can play that video. Make sure you play that video as well. When your video is done, you can switch the session from the pre-recorded video to bring yourself online, and you'll be able to answer people live Q&A. And make sure when you are inside the booth or you're inside a session that you can switch the chat from event to session or event to booth, and you'll be able to talk to people specifically within your session or within your booth too, so you can keep the conversation separate. But if you're a speaker, a programmer, and your session is in the expo session, the expo part of Hoppin', make sure you let people know within the booth, hey, I'm here, we're gonna watch this video, and then I'm going to toggle myself onto live video, answer any of your questions. That will be great. So I'm gonna go get some lunch real quick. It will be dormant until 1:30, and at 1:30 we will bring up Washington, DC's State of State. Thank you. Hello, and thank you for joining the Canaanite Conference, the country's first Mid-Atlantic Cannabis Conference, brought to you by the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. If you're watching this session is all about fundraising beyond investors. How can you raise money in various ways? How can you ensure you have good accounting and financial practices to keep your dreams and business alive? Participating in this conversation is Asia Atwood, CEO of Trello Technology, and Jessica Velasquez, the treasurer of the Minority Cannabis Business Association. Can you raise money in various ways? How can you ensure you have a good conversation? I'm really excited to talk about this. Money is important to keep your businesses alive. So I really appreciate you both joining for this important conversation.
Pleasure to be here.
So we're going to get right into this. But first, before we get into the nitty gritty of accounting and fundraising, can you just give viewers a little bit more background information of both of your organizations, your businesses, and who you are? Jessica, I'll start with you first.
Thank you so much again for having me here. As you mentioned, I am the treasurer for the Minority Cannabis Business Association and have been in this seat for about 2 years now. The organization is a national trade association that focuses on lifting minorities in the industry and providing them with education and opportunities to succeed. But in addition, I serve as founder and managing partner of Indiva Advisors. We are a CPA firm that specifically caters to the cannabis and hemp industries. I've been doing this for a few years now. How I got into it, I felt definitely when I saw legalization on the forefront in 2014, that this was what I wanted to do and what I wanted to be when I grew up. The fact that, I saw legalization in my lifetime was definitely a calling for me to join the industry and bring my tools and skills that I built in my profession so that I can service the industry and make a difference there. That's what brought me to cannabis.
Give me a second. Asia, your turn. Can you introduce yourself and tell us more about you and your business?
Sure. Well, thank you, David, for having me on the Canaanite Conference. I'm really glad to be a part of it. I am located in Massachusetts, but grew up in Philadelphia, and that's kind of how we connected. So thank you for including me on this. I'm currently the CEO of Trello Technologies. I'm one of 2 co-founders, but I'm also an engineer by degree and a cannabis patient, medical patient. And I came into the industry back in 2014 when I started to first learn about the medicinal value of cannabis. Similar to a lot of people, I understood the recreational value, but I didn't really understand the health benefits until I needed to use it for myself. So in doing some research about that, I learned how to grow and developed a problem in my own grow lab, my own grow room that I needed to solve. And that problem was trying to control very tall sativa strains, and even outside of sativa strains, trying to control very tall plants to grow in my basement, in my grow room. I had limited height. A lot of other people have limited height and have limitations on space as well. So while I was traveling a lot for my day job, I needed a solution that would help me to train my plants so they wouldn't get out of control. So myself and one other co-founder got together and developed a system that automatically trains tall plants to grow sideways, horizontally, so you can control that height, get a nice even plant canopy, increase harvest. But when you control the height, you can stack them and you can make the most out of your space. So it was a problem that we were solving for ourselves that we found other people had the same issue. So we decided to try to solve it for others. So if you want to learn more about that, you can check it out at trello.io. But the other thing that's important to me about this cannabis space and being an engineer is before I got into cannabis, I was a risk engineer, really with natural catastrophes. So focusing on things that impact businesses, properties, from earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, which we're experiencing a lot. Earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, which we're experiencing a lot right now. So for me, the big mission, the big push is trying to figure out how can we do indoor farming, indoor growing in a sustainable method, because we need to protect our food supply, we need to protect our medicine. So indoor farming is where my focus is on trying to make sure that it's sustainable and ready for the new world that we created.
And certainly, as the climate continues to change, that is going to become even more pressing and more important, more than ever. Risk assessment, that is a good segue into our second question, because we know, I'm sure, as people who are interested in getting into the cannabis industry, whether you want to get a license, whether you want to create an ancillary business, there's some things that you need to consider first. And we're going to talk about kind of the big thing that's impacting a lot of businesses is the 280E tax code within the IRS tax code. What is 280E? We hear about that a lot on how that's impacting cannabis businesses within the industry, but can either of you describe a little bit more of what 280E is and why is that important for people to know? I'll open that up.
Happy to take the lead on this one. We deal with this issue every day in our work and our client base. IRS code section 280E, simply stated, says that an operator that is trafficking in the Controlled Substances Act, which is where cannabis falls as Schedule 1 under the CSA, cannot deduct any operating expenses related to that business. And the only expense that they are able to deduct is the cost of their goods sold. In other words, the inventory that they either purchase if they are a retailer or produce if they're a cultivator or in the production space. So this code section specifically applies to all of our plant touching operators, our licensees, folks that are either, again, selling or producing a cannabis product. This section was enacted in the early 1980s when the war on drugs campaign was really hot and heavy during the Reagan administration. I do not believe that they would have ever envisioned that, a few decades later, almost 40 years later, that we would have legal cannabis. And this archaic code section would hinder us in what is our growth stage, right? And so because of this law, we have what should be effective tax rates around the norm of 21%. That's the corporate tax rate currently. We're seeing effective tax rates as high as 70% for some of our clients because of 280E. So really impactful. There's a lot of current, potential legislation that would do away with that, such as the MORE Act, that would deschedule cannabis and again provide for this lift of 280E implications to our plant touching operators. But very impactful.
And I'll just add to that. I mean, that was one of the things that even as we're not a plant touching company, we're considered an ancillary cannabis company, which means that we don't really touch the cannabis product. We sell equipment for those individuals that touch the product. But we did have to be careful about how we delineate who our customers are. And if they are all majority licensed cultivators, then we might wind up being treated the same way. So even if you're an ancillary business, it is something that you need to consider and be aware of.
That's actually surprising. I thought ancillary businesses were a little bit more protected, but I didn't even realize that if you have a large clientele of people who are actually touching the plant, that you might be lumped into that same scenario, which would be devastating, right?
Yeah, we haven't seen that in case law. We really haven't. The majority of all of the case law specific in this industry has been around licensed operators, right? Again, our plant touching licensees and the impact that 280E has on that. I would argue strongly that 280E does not impact ancillary companies, nor should it, because we do not traffic in the context of 280E. That just does not apply to us. We provide services, we provide products, we provide a multitude of other things, but we do not either sell or produce the plant. So again, I would they know if you're an ancillary company, hopefully this is not one of the things that you should be worried about.
That's good.
Yeah, great for us, great for Asia, right? A company like yourself and you branching out into providing a service to the industry. And again, a firm like ours that does the same.
Yeah, and the ancillary business, it definitely does provide the protection. As a risk engineer, I always had, I'm saying, what's the maybes that we haven't experienced?
We don't know what the government's doing, right?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit but yeah, those protections for ancillary businesses are huge, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the panel.
Yes, and so let's get into the money talk. Is it wrong for me to say that outside of, having to hustle for investors, is it wrong to say that there are a myriad of other ways to raise money? Or is investment really for building a cannabis ancillary business, so to speak? Is investing and trying to get investors for direct financial support, is that the only way to go? I'll open that up to both of y'all.
Yeah, that one's a doozy. Please, Asia.
Yeah, so I mean, that the decision on how to get funding was actually huge and what pushed us towards ancillary. We were thinking about whether or not we wanted to get a license and do the tech business at the same time. But it's really, getting the license and going through that legal avenue is almost a full-time job in itself. So we decided to kind of stay in the ancillary space. And one of the other reasons we were worried about that was the huge amount of capital that you have to get into the cannabis space. But quite frankly, even in the tech industry, even in agri-tech, you need a lot of money to move as well. But doing some research, and I was also part of another startup before the startup I'm in, but doing some research, I was trying to figure out different ways that I could fund the business, and found that the majority of companies don't use VC or angel investors to start their companies. And this is all industries, not just cannabis, but all industries. The majority of them are with personal savings, your own credit cards, or your friends and your family. That's like 90% of the way that people start businesses. So if you're in the cannabis space, you may need to either find family and friends or use your own personal savings if you can. But again, because it's such a huge upfront expenditure, that might be pretty hard for people to do. So we went in the direction of crowdfunding. And that was something else that's another avenue that people could take. You could do what's called rewards-based crowdfunding, or you could do service donation-based crowdfunding, or you could do equity crowdfunding. And I won't get into that too much right now, but I did just want to mention that there are lots of other ways to raise capital besides trying to find that one investor or those 2 or 3 investors. And usually, in order to do so, you need to either have connections, be in that network, know those individuals already. You can't really, so if you don't, I can't just come up to someone on the street and say, hey, invest in my company. You can't do that. But you can with regulation crowdfunding, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. So you really have to know people. You have to already have a network. You have to be around people who have a high net worth that can actually maybe even invest in you. And for the good majority of us, that's not where we land. And that's not where I landed or my co-founder landed. So we had to come out of pocket. We had to do the personal, bootstrap, use our savings. And then that got us to a certain point. And then after that, we went to crowdfunding. So I do think you're going to have to be creative. I've seen individuals in the cannabis space that are trying to find money, trying to raise money. They sell something else that's not cannabis related. They may sell their service, or they may create a real estate trust and try to, move money through that avenue. But you do have to be creative in order to raise money. And I think that's just not in cannabis, it's in general.
Yeah, I would agree with Asia. In general, it is about 90% of businesses that get funded through friends and family. So it's money that we know. It's money that's around us. It's people that are in our network that are going to support, this new venture that we're doing. Those are probably that's the first place you should be looking, is in that group. And even before that, some of the things that are important, even when you're having those conversations with friends and family, is the business plan. You know, that's the first thing I want to talk about with my clients. And it's really where I started as well. It's developing a business plan. What did I see for Indiva advisors? What was that going to look like as far as services and, you know, revenue and my expenditures? Did I have a good sense of what I needed to get that company off the ground and make it succeed? And putting that together in a solid business plan is what you know, I was able to you know, provide to an angel investor that actually gave me $50,000 in addition to my own money to start the company, because it was you know, what I believe a well thought out plan, and it gave them comfort. Money is going to also succeed, that they're going to get their return on their investment. And so speaking to what investors are looking to is important. But going back to comments that Asia mentioned, I think, again, crowdfunding is a great source of potential capital for the right company. So those participants are also looking for a, you know, what are they investing in? So I come back to that business plan. But most recently too, I will say this, in the industry, I've seen a few additional sources of lending now open up. Are lenders that are willing to provide capital. It's at some higher rates than our traditional financing sources. So it is, you know, higher than 10%, lower than, let's say, 25%. But again, other options are now available where, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, we just didn't even have that. And so there are a few additional avenues, and it really, I think, starts with a solid business plan. So you're attracting the right investors and capital to your business.
Thank you. Business plan, having a foundational business plan is definitely the first step before launching. But even with, you know, business plans, sometimes we know, and I'm sure both of y'all have seen, that sometimes things don't go the way that we plan, and the financial directions that we want to go sometimes just don't happen in the way that we want, or the money that we're raising doesn't come from the sources that initially envisioned. Let's talk a little bit about kind of mistakes we've learned in this space, especially when it comes from an accounting and financial perspective.